He didn't ask her. He didn't even look at her when he said it. Robert Colton stood at the head of the supper table, glass raised, voice loud enough to carry across the whole dining room, and announced to 23 ranch hands, neighbors, and family friends that his daughter Rachel would be marrying Edwin Voss by the end of summer. Just like that. No warning, no conversation, no moment where he pulled her aside and said, "Rachel, I need to talk to you about your future." Nothing. He simply stood up, cleared his throat, and sold her, right there between the biscuits and the gravy, in front of everyone she had ever known. Rachel was still holding her fork. She set it down slowly because her hand had started to shake, and she didn't want anyone to see that. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter in your own life, like the people who were supposed to love you made decisions for you instead of with you, then stay with me, because this story is going to mean something to you. Before we go further, if you're new here, please take a moment and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Stories like Rachel's are what this channel is built on. And if this one moves you, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that dining room and to the moment Rachel Colton's life changed without her permission. The dining room of the Colton Ranch smelled like wood smoke and pot roast, and on any other Tuesday night, Rachel would have found that comforting. She had eaten at that table her entire life. She knew every scratch in the surface, every uneven leg that made the whole thing tilt slightly south. She had helped her mother set it 1,000 times and cleared it 10,000 more. But that night, the familiar room felt like a trap closing around her. "To Rachel and Edwin," her father said, still not looking at her, eyes moving around the table instead, collecting congratulations like coins. A fine match, a fine future for this family. People raised their glasses. Someone whooped. Old Harlan from the South Pasture clapped like he was at a barn dance. Rachel sat perfectly still. Edwin Voss was seated 3 chairs down from her. He was 34, well-dressed in the way that people who've never done physical labor are well-dressed. Everything clean, everything pressed, nothing worn the way real clothes get worn. He had his father's jaw and his father's habit of looking at things the way you look at property you're considering purchasing. When the toast landed, he turned to Rachel with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and lifted his glass in her direction. She did not lift hers back. He noticed. His smile thinned just slightly at the corners, and he looked away like it hadn't happened. That was Edwin Voss in one small moment, a man who expected things to go his way and had learned to quietly ignore the evidence when they didn't. Rachel's mother, seated to her right, reached under the table and pressed her hand. It was meant to be comforting. It wasn't. It was the touch of a woman who had been through the same thing and had made peace with it decades ago. And that peace felt, right then, like a warning about what happened to women who stopped fighting. "Mama," Rachel said quietly. "Not now," her mother said, just as quietly. "Did you know?" A beat of silence. Her mother's hand pressed a little harder, and that was the answer. Rachel pulled her hand away. She picked her fork back up because she needed something to do with her fingers. She cut a piece of roast she had no intention of eating and moved it around the plate while conversation swelled around her, while her father laughed too loudly at something Edwin's father said about merger and legacy and the future of the land. The future of the land. Not the future of his daughter, the future of the land. She was 31 years old. She had spent the last 12 years managing the ranch's livestock logs, tracking every head of cattle through the seasons, flagging errors in the supply orders that nobody else caught. She woke before sunrise most mornings, and she didn't complain about it. She had patched fence line in the rain, helped pull calves in weather that turned a person's fingers numb. And once, she never told her father this, she had driven 30 miles alone in the dark to pick up an emergency part for the water pump because nobody else was awake and the pasture was running dry. She had done all of that, and she was still sitting at a table where her own future had just been announced to her like a weather report. She thought, if I were a son, he would have talked to me first. She thought, if I were a son, he'd have asked what I thought. She put her fork down again. She wasn't going to eat. There was no point pretending. It was the sound of boots on hardwood that made her look up. Not at Edwin, not at her father. At the far end of the room, near the doorway that connected to the back hallway, where the kitchen ran and where the working men came through when they needed to pass, a ranch hand she hadn't paid much attention to was standing in the frame of the door. He wasn't in the room. He hadn't been invited to supper. He'd clearly come through for some other reason, maybe to speak to the foreman or to drop something off, and had stopped when he heard the noise of celebration. He was holding his hat in both hands. He had the posture of a man who knew exactly when he wasn't supposed to be somewhere. He was looking at her, not at Edwin, not at her father, not at the general spectacle of the toast. He was looking at Rachel specifically, and his expression was the only one in the room that wasn't celebrating. It wasn't pity either. She would have hated pity. It was just honest. It was the face of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and didn't pretend otherwise. Then Edwin's father said something that made the room laugh, and the noise broke the moment, and the man in the doorway turned and walked back down the hall. Just gone. No drama, no lingering. He simply left. Rachel stared at the empty doorway for a moment. She didn't know his name. She thought she'd seen him working the east fence line a few days ago, new hire probably, one of the handful her father had taken on for the season. Medium height, worn jacket, the kind of hands that came from work, not from shaking them. She turned back to her plate, and the moment closed over like water closing over a stone. But she remembered the doorway. She remembered those few seconds of being truly seen in a room full of people who were looking straight through her. She thought about it later that night when she couldn't sleep, lying in the dark with the ceiling fan turning slow overhead, listening to the ranch settle around her the way old structures do, creak and sigh, creak and sigh. He didn't congratulate me. That was the thing. Every person in that dining room had offered her some version of congratulations, even the ones who probably sensed the truth, even the ones who knew her well enough to read the stillness she'd held all through supper. They had smiled and clinked and said how wonderful, because that is what people do when they don't want to step into someone else's trouble. But the man in the doorway had said nothing at all. He had just looked at her like a person who was paying attention and then walked away. She didn't know why, but that mattered more than all the glasses raised in her name. Morning came early, and Rachel let it. She was up before the sky turned, dressed before her mother knocked on her door, and out to the barn before the first ranch hand arrived. She needed the work. She needed something her hands could do that her mind couldn't argue with. The barn was still and dim, that particular kind of quiet that only lives in the early hours when the animals are just waking. She went to the first stall on the left, where a 3-year-old roan she'd been watching for hoof rot was standing with his head low. She checked his leg. The inflammation was down. Small victory, but she'd take it. She was moving to the second stall when she heard something. At first she thought it was one of the horses shifting, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. She moved toward the back of the barn, past the tack room and the feed storage, and found the source. The man from the doorway was crouched beside a bay mare in the last stall, working a brush through her foreleg with slow, careful strokes. The horse was leaning into it. He was talking to her in a low voice, too quiet for Rachel to make out the words, the kind of murmur people use when they're not trying to be heard, just keeping a scared animal calm. He heard Rachel's boots on the floor and looked up. He wasn't startled. He had the stillness of someone accustomed to being approached by things that could either hurt him or didn't. She picked up a stone in the south pasture yesterday, he said. Leg was heating up. I cleaned it out last night, but I wanted to check the swelling this morning. It was the most natural thing in the world, the way he said it. Not apologetic, not asking permission, just explaining, the way you explain a practical thing to another practical person. She's my horse, Rachel said. I know. You didn't ask. No, he said. I didn't. He went back to brushing. If you want me to leave her alone, I will. Rachel stood there for a moment, watching him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was doing the thing that needed doing because the animal needed it, and apparently that was enough reason for him. She leaned against the stall frame. What's your name? Sam Reeve? How long have you been on? 3 weeks Thursday. She nodded. She hadn't learned his name in 3 weeks, which said something about her state of mind lately. She noticed the right things in the pasture and the ledger books, but she'd missed a whole person. What did you think, she said, of the announcement last night? She didn't know why she asked it. It wasn't the kind of thing you asked a man who'd been on the payroll 3 weeks. But it was still dark outside, and the barn was quiet, and he was the only person who hadn't congratulated her. Sam looked up again. He took his time about it. I think, he said, that your face told a different story than your father's voice. The mare shifted. He put a hand on her shoulder and she stilled. That's all I'll say about it, he added. Why? Because it's not my business. He stood up slowly, brushing hay from his knee. He was taller than he'd seemed in the doorway. And because nobody asked me. I'm asking you. He looked at her a long moment. There was something careful in him, not guarded exactly, but deliberate, like a man who had learned to think before he spoke because words had cost him things before. I don't congratulate people on something they didn't choose, he said finally. Doesn't feel right. Never has. Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically. Not the way things shift in the stories her mother used to read to her as a girl, with music swelling in the background. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut, just a crack, just enough to let the air change. She didn't say anything for a moment. The leg should be fine in a day or two, Sam said, and crouched back down to the horse. I'll keep an eye on it. All right, Rachel said. She walked back up the barn to the roan, picked up a brush, and got to work. The two of them stayed like that for the better part of an hour, 50 feet apart, saying nothing else, while the barn slowly filled with the sounds of morning. 2 days later, Edwin Voss came to Sunday dinner and brought flowers. They were the wrong kind, showy hothouse things that couldn't survive a single night of real weather. But he presented them to Rachel's mother with a broad smile, and her mother said how lovely in a voice that she used when she meant to close a conversation before it started. Edwin sat across from Rachel at the family table and talked mostly to her father. He talked about interest rates and land values and the bank's expanded portfolio in the eastern counties. And Rachel sat and listened and thought about ledger columns, the way she always did when she needed to keep her face neutral, running numbers in her head, tracing the figures that needed reconciling this week, calculating what the summer feed costs would do to the quarterly margin. Rachel, Edwin said at one point, turning to her, I thought we might ride out to see the West Acreage on Saturday. Your father says the view from the ridge is something. She looked at him. It's a working day. I'm sure an exception could be made. Her father was already nodding. Of course it can. Rachel set her water glass down carefully. I have to finish the third quarter records by end of week. Saturday is the only time I have. Edwin's smile stayed, but something behind it didn't. Surely someone else can handle the paperwork. I do the records, she said. I've done them for 6 years. Nobody else does them. There was a pause. Edwin looked at her father. Her father cleared his throat. Rachel is very dedicated, her father said, in the way that people say something true while meaning something else entirely. Edwin turned back to Rachel with a different kind of smile, the polished kind, the kind that said he'd let this go for now because he had time. Of course, he said. Saturday then, whenever you're free. She had not agreed to Saturday. But somehow by the end of that sentence, it had become a plan. She ate the rest of her dinner in silence, calculating feed costs, and nobody in the room noticed the difference. That same afternoon, when Edwin's car had gone down the drive and her father had retreated to his office, and her mother was in the kitchen doing the work that always fell to her mother, Rachel went back to the barn. She told herself she was checking on the roan. She was checking on the roan. Sam was at the far end of the paddock replacing a section of gate hinge that had been stripping for weeks. She'd flagged it twice in the maintenance log, and it had been ignored twice, but apparently Sam had noticed it too. That's been on the list since March, she said, walking up. I know. He didn't look up from the bolt. I read the log. You read the maintenance log? When I start somewhere, I read what there is to read. He set the wrench, tested the hinge. It held. Helps me understand what I'm walking into. She thought about that. Most of the hands didn't bother with the log. Most of the hands didn't know there was a log. Edwin Voss was here for dinner, she said. Sam checked the second bolt. He didn't say anything. He'll be here most Sundays now, I expect. Still nothing. You're allowed to have an opinion, she said, and there was a small edge in her voice she hadn't planned for. Sam set the wrench down and stood up to his full height and looked at her. In the afternoon light, with the dust off the paddock between them, she could see him more clearly than she had in the barn. He had a weathered face, the kind that gave away years of outdoor work, but not age exactly. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when his expression shifted. I think, he said, that you already know what you want to say about it. You don't need my opinion. You need someone to say it's okay to say it out loud. She stared at him. That's not something I'm in a position to give you, he said, and picked up the wrench again. But I hope somebody does. He went back to work. Rachel stood at the fence for a moment, hands on the top rail, looking out across the paddock at nothing in particular. The wind came across the flat ground and pushed at her hair and didn't fix anything. She went back inside. But she came back to the barn the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the second week, she had learned that Sam Reeve had grown up on a working ranch in a dry county 2 states over, that he'd left at 19 after a disagreement with his older brother over the direction of the land, that he had spent the years between then and now moving between ranches the way some men move between towns. Not restless exactly, but not settled either. Like a man looking for something he couldn't quite name. She learned that he was precise about tools and loose about schedule, that he could read a horse's temperament before he touched it, that he had strong opinions about fence line quality and almost no opinions about things that didn't matter. He didn't talk about himself easily. Information came out in pieces, attached to practical things, the way a man talks when he's accustomed to being judged on work rather than words. She learned, over those 2 weeks, that he was the most straightforwardly decent person she had met in longer than she could remember. That frightened her a little, the realizing of it, because she also understood, even as she was learning it, that what she was feeling didn't solve a single thing about her actual situation. It didn't change her father's plans. It didn't change Edwin's presence at the Sunday table. It didn't change the financial pressure behind the whole arrangement, the whispers she'd overheard enough of to understand that her father's ranch was not as solvent as it appeared, and that Edwin Voss's family bank was meant to fix that. A feeling was just a feeling. It didn't pay a bill. But she kept coming back to the barn. And Sam kept being there, steady and unhurried and entirely, bewilderingly real. It was on a Thursday, the 3rd week, that the thing happened which changed the temperature of everything. Rachel was going over the cattle records in her father's study while her father was in town. She had found an error, not a small one, in the ledger for the spring grazing, numbers transposed, which seemed harmless until you followed the chain of them and realized that a significant delivery cost had been double counted for 4 consecutive months, quietly inflating the apparent expenses in a way that had affected 2 downstream decisions about headcount. She had caught it in under an hour. She made the corrections, noted them clearly, and brought them to her father's foreman, a man named Dale, who had been running operations for 9 years, and who looked at Rachel's corrections with the expression of a man being shown a card trick he couldn't explain. "I'll pass it to your father," Dale said. "It's already fixed," Rachel said. "I just wanted you to have the corrected copy." "I'll still pass it to him." "Of course." She walked out of the foreman's office and nearly ran into Sam, who was coming around the corner of the equipment shed with a length of new fence cable over one shoulder. He stopped. She stopped. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. He looked at her the way he looked at horses, carefully, without rushing. "I found an error in the grazing ledger," she said. 4 months of compounding. It's fixed now." "How long did it take you to find it?" "About 45 minutes. He adjusted the cable on his shoulder. "How long has it been wrong?" "Since January." He nodded slowly. "Does Dale know that?" "He will." Sam looked at her for another moment. "That's going to save real money," he said. It was a plain statement, not a compliment, just an acknowledgement of a fact. "I know," she said. "Your father know you're doing this kind of work?" "My father knows I do the records." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. Something in the directness of it pulled at her. Not romantically, not in that simple way. More like standing near the edge of something high and feeling the pull of the air. It was the feeling of being seen accurately and not being able to look away from it. "No," she said. "I don't think he knows what I'm doing." "He should," Sam said. Then he walked past her toward the fence line, the cable shifting on his shoulder, and that was that. Rachel stood in the gap between the shed and the path, in the dry afternoon heat, and felt the edges of something she hadn't named yet beginning to take shape. She didn't know what it was going to cost her. She didn't know, standing there, that the real test was still coming. For her, for Sam, for every assumption her father had built his future on. But she felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Something was coming, and nothing after it was going to look the same. The weather came 3 days later, not as a metaphor, but as an actual thing. A hard-driving summer storm that rolled in off the flatland without much warning and turned the ranch into a maze of mud and downed branches and animals that needed moving before the creek behind the south pasture rose any further. Rachel heard it building before she saw it. That particular low pressure that made the cattle uneasy, that made the air feel close and wrong. She was at the kitchen table finishing the corrected grazing ledger, printing the numbers clean, making sure the notations were clear enough that even her father couldn't misread them, when the first real crack of thunder hit close enough to rattle the window glass. She was outside in under 2 minutes. The south pasture was her first concern. They had 14 head of young stock down there that had been rotated in that morning, and the creek bank on the eastern edge had been soft all week from the earlier rains. If it rose fast, which it could, which it had before, those animals would crowd the fence line and that fence line would give. She didn't go to find Dale. She didn't go to find her father. She grabbed her rain slicker off the peg by the back door, shoved her feet into her boots, and ran. The yard was already slick. The sky had gone the particular green-gray color that meant business, and the wind was picking up direction changes every few minutes, the kind that made animals spin in circles and people second-guess themselves. She hit the gate to the south pasture at a run and got it open, and then she stopped. Someone was already there. Sam was in the middle of the pasture in the driving rain without a slicker, moving the cattle in a wide arc away from the creek side, working the outside edge of the herd with a long, easy stride that kept them calm instead of spooking them into a run. He had no dog, no other hand with him, just himself and the knowledge of how to move without triggering panic. Rachel went in from the opposite side without speaking. She knew what needed doing. She took the left wing, and he had the right, and between them they walked the animals up the slope and through the upper gate in under 20 minutes. Neither of them said a word the entire time. There was nothing to say. They each understood the problem and the solution, and they worked it out in the same direction without bumping into each other once. When the last animal was through and Rachel latched the upper gate, she was soaked through her slicker, and her boots were solid mud, and her hair was plastered to her face. Sam latched the chain on his side. He looked exactly as wet as she did, shirt dark and heavy, hair flat to his forehead. "Creek?" he said. "Already rising," she said. "I checked it this morning." He looked up at the sky. The thunder was moving east now, the worst of it passing. "These animals will be fine here tonight?" "Yes. Higher ground, better drainage." He nodded. He shook water off his hands in a gesture that was more habit than useful. "You didn't have a slicker," Rachel said. "Mine's got a tear in the left shoulder. Wasn't worth it." She looked at him. "You went out in this without a slicker because yours had a tear." "I went out in this because the cattle needed moving." He said it the same way he said everything, not sharp, not dismissive, just plain. She almost said something about that, about the specific kind of stubbornness that looked like practicality from a certain angle. She stopped herself. "Thank you," she said instead. He looked at her briefly, then looked away at the herd settling on the upper slope. "You would have gotten them up here without me. Would have taken longer." "Yes." "Then it was just faster," he said. "That's all." He started back toward the barn, and Rachel walked beside him, rain still coming down in the intermittent way that storms have when they're deciding whether they're finished. And she thought about what it meant that he had come out alone before anyone asked, and done the right thing quietly, and refused to take credit for it. She had met men who talked about hard work constantly. She had rarely met one who just did it. Her father found out about the ledger error the following morning, not from Dale, which Rachel had expected. From Edwin's father, Franklin Voss, who had apparently heard about it from somewhere, she never traced exactly where, and had called the ranch to ask some pointed questions about the accuracy of the financial records. Rachel was in the barn when her father came to find her. She knew from his footsteps that it wasn't a social visit. Her father had two ways of moving through the barn: the slow amble of a man taking inventory, and the deliberate stride of a man with something to say. She heard the second one. "Franklin Voss called me this morning," her father said, stopping at the stall where she was working. She kept her hands on what she was doing. "About what?" "About errors in our records. He seemed to know about them before I did. He said the last 4 words the way you say something that you're going to come back to." "I corrected the records on Thursday," Rachel said. "I noted the corrections clearly in the ledger. I gave Dale a copy." "Dale told me this morning." "Then you knew before Franklin Voss called." I knew about the correction. I didn't know the error went back 4 months. His voice was measured. Not angry yet. Working toward it. 4 months, Rachel. How long have you been catching errors without telling me? She put the brush down and turned to face him. I've been doing the records for 6 years. If I corrected every small error the moment I found it and brought it to you, we'd spend half our time in paperwork conversations. I fix what I find. That's what you told me to do. This wasn't a small error. No, it wasn't. And I fixed it. He looked at her for a moment. There was something complicated moving behind his face. The particular discomfort of a man who wants to be angry but can't quite justify it. Franklin thinks there may be other errors, he said. There aren't. How can you be sure? Because I know these records, Daddy. I know them the way you know this land. I can tell you the cost variance per head for every season going back 4 years. I can tell you where the errors in this ledger usually appear and why. I can tell you that the double count in the spring grazing happened because Dale's crew changed the supplier mid-season and nobody updated the coding system. She said it without heat, without raising her voice. Just the facts, laid flat. There are no other errors. Silence. Her father looked at the horse in the stall behind her, then back at her. Franklin suggested, he said, that we bring in an outside accountant to review the books before the engagement is formalized. Rachel heard that with the particular clarity you hear things that are meant as an insult but pretending to be something else. An outside accountant. To review the books she had maintained without a single unresolved error for 6 years. If that's what you want, she said, it's what Franklin thinks is appropriate. I understand. Rachel, I said I understand. She picked up the brush again. Tell him to send whoever he wants. Her father stood there another moment. She could feel him trying to find the thing he should say and not finding it. I'm not questioning your work, he said finally. I know, she said, but Franklin Voss is, and right now his opinion weighs more than mine. She didn't say it bitterly. She said it the way you say something true that nobody wants to hear. Go ahead and tell him to send someone. He left. His footsteps going back out were slower than the ones coming in. Rachel stood in the stall and breathed through the tightness in her chest until it loosened a little. The horse beside her shifted and bumped her shoulder with his nose, the absent-minded affection of an animal that doesn't know what's wrong but knows something is. I know, she said to him quietly. I know. Sam was replacing boards on the far side of the equipment shed when she found him that afternoon. She hadn't gone looking for him exactly. She had been walking because she needed to move, and he happened to be where her walking took her. She leaned against the shed wall and watched him work. He didn't stop. He had a rhythm with the hammer that was unhurried and accurate. He didn't waste swings, didn't show off, just drove each nail clean and moved to the next. My father's bringing in an outside accountant to review the ledgers, she said. Sam drove a nail. At Franklin Voss's suggestion, she said. He straightened up, looked at the board he'd just set, ran a hand along it to check the level. Because of the error I found, she said. The one I fixed. I heard your father came through the barn this morning, Sam said. You didn't hear what was said? No, I was at the creek checking the bank. Wanted to make sure it held after last night. He turned to look at her. Did it surprise you? The accountant thing? She thought about that honestly. No, she said. Not really. Then why are you out here telling me about it? It was the kind of question that would have stung coming from anyone else. From Sam, it didn't sting. It just landed with a thud of truth she had to sit with. Because I'm angry, she said, and I don't have anyone else to be angry at out loud. He set the hammer down on the board pile. Then say it. She looked at him. What? Whatever you want to say it. I'm not going to repeat it, and I'm not going to tell you shouldn't feel it. She opened her mouth, and for a second nothing came out, the way it doesn't when you've spent so long managing what you show people that the machinery jams when you try to run it in reverse. Then she said, I've kept those books cleaner than anyone in this county could keep them. I found an error that nobody else would have caught for months, possibly years, and fixed it, and the response is to bring in a stranger to make sure I didn't make anything else up. And nobody, not my father, not Dale, not Edwin, who apparently knows about my family's financial records now before I've even agreed to marry him, nobody said one word about the fact that I found it in the first place. She stopped. Her voice had gotten quieter toward the end, not louder, the way real anger sometimes goes when it runs up against something it can't fight. There it is, Sam said. It's not rational. It's completely rational. I can't change how they see me. He picked the hammer back up. Not by staying inside their picture of what you're supposed to be, he said. He drove a nail. But that's not something I can fix for you. I'm not asking you to fix it. Good. He drove another nail. Because I can't. She pushed off the wall. She felt slightly better and slightly worse, the way you do when you've said a true thing and the true thing doesn't actually solve anything. She had almost reached the corner of the shed when Sam said, without turning around, "You should have been managing those books with a real title behind your name, not just doing it because nobody else bothered." She stopped. He wasn't looking at her. He was lining up the next board. She didn't say anything. She walked back to the house. The outside accountant came on a Tuesday. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was 60-something, careful, dry in manner, with the unhurried competence of a man who had sat across from a lot of worried families in his career. He spent 2 days with the records. He sat at the table in the small office off the kitchen that Rachel used, the table she had sat at, the lamp she had bought herself because the overhead light gave her headaches. And he went through 6 years of ledgers with a systematic patience that Rachel recognized because she had the same quality herself. On the afternoon of the second day, he found her in the hallway. "Miss Colton," he said, "Mr. Marsh, I'd like to ask you some questions about the coding system for the supplier records, if you have a few minutes." She followed him back into the office. He sat down. She sat across from him, in the chair where people usually sat when they came to her with questions about the records. For 2 hours, Gerald Marsh asked her questions that nobody had ever asked her about the ranch's finances. Not broad questions, specific ones, the kind that required real knowledge to answer. He asked about her methodology for handling split deliveries, about her system for flagging seasonal discrepancies, about how she had developed the cross-referencing process she used for the cattle records. She answered all of it. When he finally set down his pencil, he looked at her over his reading glasses for a moment. "These are good books," he said. She waited. "The correction you made was accurate and appropriately documented," he said. "The error itself appears to have originated in a supplier coding issue that predated your management by at least a year. You caught it. You fixed it correctly." He gathered his papers with the deliberate motions of a man who said things once and meant them. "In my professional opinion, your financial management of this operation is well above average." Rachel felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't known was clenched. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." He stood. "I'll be telling your father the same thing." "I know you will." He paused at the door. "You should have a title, young lady, not just a table and a lamp." She stared at him. He walked out. She sat alone at her table for a long time after that, lamp humming softly, late afternoon light moving across the corrected ledger pages, and thought about Sam saying almost the exact same words 2 days earlier, and about how strange it was that a stranger and a ranch hand both saw what everyone closest to her had been looking past for years. Edwin came to dinner that Sunday with a new suit and a story about an investment opportunity in the eastern counties that his family was pursuing. He talked about it through the soup and into the main course, and Rachel noticed that he talked about money the way some people talk about the weather, as a backdrop to everything, a condition of life, the thing against which all other things were measured. He also, at one point, asked her what she thought of the record situation. "Gerald Marsh told my father the books were well managed," she said. "Yes, he mentioned that to our accountant as well." Edwin touched the corner of his mouth with his napkin. "Still, it might be worthwhile to think about bringing someone professional in on a permanent basis. Once we're married, the financial picture will be more complex." Rachel set her fork down. She did it quietly, no drama. "I am someone professional." Edwin smiled. "Of course. I only mean someone who can dedicate full-time. I dedicate full-time to it." "In addition to everything else you do," he said, the smooth pivot of a man who had learned to reframe when he sensed resistance. "I just think, with the ranch's finances tied to the bank's portfolio, we'll want to make sure the right systems are in place." The right systems. She turned that phrase over in her mind like a stone in a tumbler. She understood what it meant. It meant his systems, his people, his oversight. "Something to think about," her father said, because her father was always filling silences now in ways that felt like covers over exposed things. Rachel picked her fork back up. She said, which was non-committal enough that nobody pushed further, but which she noticed Edwin watching from the corner of his eye. I was keeping track of her, she realized, recording her small resistances, filing them away. She started keeping track of his. The following week, Dale came to her with a problem in the north pasture fence. Not a small one, a full 100-foot section that had been improperly tensioned when it was installed 2 seasons ago and was now bowing under pressure in 3 places. Left alone, it would fail by early fall, and if it failed with the cattle rotated there, they'd have animals in the road and potentially in the neighboring property, which belonged to a man named Tucker, who had sued over fence disputes before. She found Sam before she found Dale's crew. North pasture fence, she said, 100 feet, 3 failure points. Dale wants to replace the whole section. Sam frowned. Replacement's expensive. I know. Can I look at it? They drove out together in the ranch's old utility truck, which had a cracked dashboard and a passenger door that required a particular lift and pull motion to close properly. Sam figured out the door on the first try, which she noticed without saying so. He walked the fence line for 20 minutes without speaking. He pressed on the posts, checked the wire tension, crouched at each bowing point and studied the base. He had the unhurried quality of someone who understood that a problem looked at slowly was usually cheaper than a problem solved fast. You don't need to replace it, he said, coming back. You need to reset 4 posts, add cross-tension wiring at the 3 weak points, and replace maybe 30 feet of line in the middle section where the wire itself is fatigued. Can you do that? Me and one other person, 2 days, maybe 3 if the ground is hard around the anchor posts. She looked at the fence. She looked at him. Dale's crew would take 4 men and a week. Dale's crew would order the wrong posts, he said, not unkindly. They've done it before. She almost smiled. I'll tell my father your assessment. Or don't tell him until it's done, Sam said. He was looking at the fence, not at her. Either way's fine. She looked at him. You'd do the work before it was approved? If you approved it. I'm not the one who approves work on this ranch. He looked at her then, steady, unhurried. You should be. The wind came across the pasture and the bowing fence wire made a low sound in it, almost musical, almost like something about to break. Rachel looked at the fence and felt the weight of that word, should, sitting somewhere between a compliment and an argument she hadn't agreed to have yet. Do the work, she said. I'll handle my father. Sam gave a small nod. I'll start in the morning. She handled her father, but not easily. Robert Colton heard her assessment of the fence situation at breakfast, before he'd had enough coffee to be fully defensive, which was deliberate on her part. She laid out the problem, Sam's proposed solution, the cost comparison, and the timeline. Her father listened. He ate his eggs. He said, Who's Sam Reeve? He's been on for a month. He was the one who moved the cattle before the storm last week. Dale said that was Harlan. Dale wasn't there, Rachel said. I was. Another silence. Her father looked at his eggs. He's good with fences? He's good with practical problems, she said. He reads the maintenance log. Her father looked up at that. Something shifted in his expression. Not exactly impressed, but interested in the way that men who have built things are interested when they hear about other men who understand things. Let him try, her father said. If it holds through fall, I'll eat my hat. You don't own a hat that fits, Rachel said. Her father almost smiled. It was the first almost smile he'd given her since the announcement at supper, and it felt like something small and fragile, like a thing that could be broken easily if she pushed too hard. She didn't push. She let it sit there. The accountant, her father said. Gerald Marsh. He told me the books were good. He said it carefully, like a man approaching something he owed. I heard. I should have. He stopped, started again. Franklin Voss pushed for the review. I didn't argue with him when I should have. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was the closest her father came to one. I know, she said. The books are good, Rachel. I know they are. He nodded. He finished his eggs. He got up and put his plate in the sink himself, which he almost never did, and walked out to the day. Rachel sat at the kitchen table and finished her coffee and thought about how much ground you could cover with a person in a conversation that didn't technically say anything important. She thought about how her father's almost apology sat alongside Edwin's smooth dismissal and Sam's plain acknowledgments, and what it meant that the man who knew her least told her the most clearly what she was worth. Sam and one of the younger hands, a 22-year-old named Cody, who didn't talk much but worked hard when given clear direction, started on the fence line on Wednesday morning. Rachel checked on them twice, not to supervise, but because she had the accounts done, and the afternoon was clear and she wanted to see how the work was going. The second time she came out, Cody was taking a water break, and Sam was resetting the fourth anchor post, working with a manual post driver in the hard late summer ground. It was heavy work, and the ground wasn't giving easily, and he was sweating through his shirt in a way that anyone watching would have registered as real effort. Rachel picked up the other side of the driver without asking. "You don't have to do that," Sam said. "I know." They set the post together. It went in cleaner with two people. Sam checked the plumb, adjusted slightly, checked again. "Level?" Rachel said. "Close enough." "It's either level or it isn't." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not quite amusement, not quite exasperation. "It's within 1 degree, in range for this application." "That's what level means to you?" "That's what functional means," he said. "There's a difference." Cody, sitting on the tailgate with his water, was carefully looking at the fence line. Rachel looked at the post. "It's fine," she said. "That's what I said." She let go of the driver. She looked down the fence line where the new wires were already running cleaner, the old sag gone from the middle section. He'd been right about not replacing the whole thing. She could see that plainly. The practical intelligence of the solution, the economy of it, the way it solved the actual problem instead of the visible one. "You're going to make your father eat a hat," she said. "He doesn't own one that fits," Sam said, straight-faced. She turned to stare at him. "I said that this morning, at breakfast, in the house." He went back to checking the post. "Cody told me." She looked at Cody. Cody took a long drink of water and became very interested in the horizon. "Word travels," Sam said. "On this ranch it travels like fire," Rachel said. "Most ranches." He picked up the tensioning tool. "Was it a secret?" She thought about that. "No, it was just—" She stopped. "Private?" he said. "Something like that." He was working the wire now, adding tension to the new section, his hands moving with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who had done this enough times that it lived in his body. "People here like you," he said. "They talk about you because they're paying attention to you. That's not always a bad thing." She looked at him. "And what are you paying attention to?" He didn't answer for a moment. He finished the tension on the wire. He checked it with his thumb, adjusted. "Same thing I always am," he said finally. "What's true and what's not." She wasn't sure what to do with that answer, which was new for her. Rachel Colton was accustomed to knowing what to do with words. She sorted them and filed them and cross-referenced them the way she did the ledger entries. Sam's words kept landing in categories she didn't have labels for. She picked up a spare tensioning tool and started on the wire run to her left without asking if she should. Cody came off the tailgate and went back to work without being told. The three of them finished the middle section as the sun moved west, and the light went long and golden across the flat land, and nobody said much of anything, and it was the most at ease Rachel had felt in 3 weeks. Edwin called on a Friday evening. She took the call in the hallway, standing, which was always a sign of how she expected it to go. He wanted to move the engagement party up. He had a date in mind, less than 6 weeks out. He mentioned it with the particular careful lightness of someone who has already decided something and is presenting it as a question. "That's very soon," Rachel said. "My father thinks it's wise to formalize things before the fall season," Edwin said. "Financial planning reasons." "You understand." She understood. 6 weeks was a number that didn't leave much room for changing her mind. The party would formalize the engagement in front of the county, in front of the bank, in front of everyone who mattered to her father's future. And once that happened, the social weight of the thing would become its own kind of pressure. "I'll need to talk to my father," she said. "Of course," Edwin said warmly. "I've already talked to him." A pause. "He thinks it's a fine idea," Edwin said. There it was. The conversation she hadn't been invited to. The decision in motion before she'd been asked to weigh in. She stood in the hallway and breathed through it and kept her voice even. "Then I suppose it's settled," she said. "Wonderful," said Edwin. "I think you'll enjoy the party, Rachel. My mother has excellent taste." She said goodbye. She set the phone down carefully. She stood in the hallway for a moment, alone, the ranch settling around her in the early evening, the distant sound of the hands finishing up for the day. 6 weeks. She walked out the back door. Not to the barn this time. She was past pretending she wasn't walking to find Sam specifically. She went to the east fence where she knew he'd be finishing the day's work. He was. I was coiling the extra wire from the afternoon's repairs, moving through it with the methodical patience she was beginning to associate so closely with him that she could almost predict his motions. He heard her coming and he waited, not looking up until she was close. Edwin moved the engagement party up, she said. 6 weeks. Sam coiled the wire. He didn't look at her. He called my father before he asked me, she said. He called me to tell me it was settled. Sam set the coil in the truck bed. I said it was fine, she said. I don't know why I said it was fine. He finally looked at her. There was nothing complicated on his face. Not pity, not anger on her behalf, none of the things people perform when they're watching someone walk towards something bad. Just honest attention. Why do you think you said it? He asked. She looked out at the fence line, the repaired fence, the straight new posts, the properly tensioned wire. Something fixed that had been broken. Because it's what they all expected me to say, she said. And I didn't have the right words for anything else yet. He nodded slowly. Yet, he said. Just that word. Not as encouragement exactly, not as comfort. More like noting the presence of something, the way you note a change in weather or a herd moving in a new direction. A thing worth paying attention to. She stood there until the light failed and the first stars came out over the flatland, and Sam finished loading the truck, and neither of them said another word. But when she walked back to the house, her steps were different than when she'd come out. Not lighter exactly, but steadier, like someone who had found a grip on something slippery and wasn't letting go. She had said yet. She held on to that in the days that followed like a tool she hadn't learned to use yet. Small and solid and heavier than it looked. 6 weeks was not much time, but it was still time, and Rachel Colton, who could find 4 months of compounding error in 45 minutes and fix 100 feet of failing fence without being asked, understood better than most people that a lot could happen in the time everyone assumed was already decided. Edwin Voss had moved his pieces forward. He had called her father and arranged a date and said, wonderful in a voice that expected agreement the way a banker expected interest, automatically, as a feature of the arrangement. But Rachel had started keeping track, and she was very, very good at numbers. The 6 weeks did not move slowly. That was the thing nobody warned her about, how fast time runs when you're dreading where it ends up. Rachel had assumed she would feel the weeks like weight, each one pressing down a little harder. Instead, they moved the way the creek moved after the storm, faster than expected, carrying things along whether you were ready or not. The engagement party preparations filled the house with a low hum of activity that she wasn't part of but couldn't escape. Her mother consulted with Edwin's mother, Margaret Voss, on menus and guest lists, and the question of whether the party should be held at the ranch or at the Voss property in town. Margaret Voss had strong opinions about most things, and delivered them with the gentle certainty of a woman accustomed to getting her way while appearing not to want anything at all. Rachel stayed out of those conversations when she could. She worked the accounts. She checked the fence repair with Sam, which held clean through 2 weeks of variable weather. She checked on the roan, whose hoof had healed. She drove to the supply depot alone twice because it needed doing, and because she needed the hour each way with nothing but flat road and her own thoughts. She also, quietly, began going through the financial records in a different way than she had before. Not the operational ledgers, those she knew by heart. She started pulling the older files, the ones in the cabinet in the back of her father's office that nobody had touched in years. Loan documents, original land surveys, the agreements her father had made with Franklin Voss's bank going back nearly 8 years. She was looking for the shape of the thing, the real shape, not the social version her father presented at the supper table. What she found took her the better part of a week to fully understand, and when she understood it, she sat very still for a long time in the small office with the lamp humming and the evening coming in through the window. The ranch was not simply under financial pressure. The ranch had been structured gradually, over 7 years of small agreements and refinance terms, in a way that gave the Voss Bank significant leverage over the land itself. Not ownership, not yet, but the kind of leverage that becomes ownership if the right conditions are met or the wrong ones aren't. 3 notes were tied to performance thresholds, Two of those thresholds were currently marginal. If either failed in the next 18 months, the bank held options that could restructure the whole arrangement in ways that would leave her father with a fraction of what he thought he owned. She read it 3 times to make sure she was reading it right. She was reading it right. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who was good at numbers, exactly what the marriage to Edwin Voss was actually buying. It wasn't a partnership. It wasn't even security. It was a gentler version of losing, a way for her father to hand over control while calling it a family alliance, while calling it a fine match, while standing up at a supper table and raising a glass. He didn't know. She was almost certain he didn't know the full picture, because her father was not a sophisticated financial man. He was a rancher who had trusted the wrong institution too many times and hadn't read the fine print carefully enough, or hadn't had someone explain it clearly enough in plain language. She was going to have to be the one to explain it. The question was when, and whether there was anything left to do about it. She didn't go to Sam first. That mattered to her later. She was careful about the order of things. She went to her mother. Her mother was in the bedroom, sitting in the chair by the window. She always sat in at that hour, with a mending basket she'd been working through for 3 years. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, which she hadn't done since she was maybe 12 years old, and for a moment the muscle memory of it was so strong she almost couldn't speak. "Mama," she said. Her mother looked up from the mending. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Her mother set the mending down. That, more than anything, told Rachel she had her full attention. "How much does Daddy actually understand about the loan agreements with the Voss Bank?" Rachel said. Silence. "Mama." "He understands that the bank holds notes on the land," her mother said carefully. "Does he understand which notes? Does he understand the performance thresholds?" Another silence, longer. Her mother's hands rested on top of the mending basket, still. "He understands it's complicated," her mother said finally. "He's always said Franklin Voss explained it clearly." "Franklin Voss has a vested interest in explaining it a certain way," Rachel said. Her mother looked at her. "Rachel, I've read the agreements, all of them, going back to the first refinancing in the spring 8 years ago." Rachel kept her voice steady, the way she kept her hands steady when she needed to. "Mama, if 2 of the performance metrics fall below threshold in the next 18 months, and the cattle market going the way it's going, the bank has options written into those agreements that could restructure this whole operation. We could end up minority stakeholders on land our family has owned outright for 40 years. Her mother was very still. "Edwin's family bank wrote those agreements," Rachel said, "and now Edwin is marrying me." The mending basket made a small sound as her mother's hands tightened on it. "Your father doesn't know all of that," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "I don't think he does, not clearly." "Then you need to tell him." "I will." Rachel looked at her hands. "But I needed to know first if you knew, if this was something everyone understood and I was the last to see it." "I didn't know the details," her mother said. "I knew the land was carrying debt. I knew the Voss family was important to your father's plans. I knew—" She stopped. "I knew about you and Edwin before your father announced it. He told me a week ahead." "And you didn't—" Rachel caught herself. Closed that sentence off because it led somewhere that would damage something she couldn't afford to damage right now. "Okay," she said instead. "Okay." "I'm sorry," her mother said. It was the first time in Rachel's memory that her mother had said those words directly to her. "I know," Rachel said. She stood up. "I'm going to talk to him in the morning." "Wait until he's had coffee," her mother said. Old practical advice, the kind that outlasted everything. "I always do," Rachel said. "Us." She didn't wait until morning, as it turned out, because her father was still up when she came back down the hallway. She saw the light under his office door and heard the particular silence of a man sitting alone with something that wasn't agreeing with him. She knocked. "Come." He was at his desk with a glass of bourbon he hadn't drunk much of, and a letter that he turned face down when she came in, which she noted. "Sit down," he said. She sat. For a moment neither of them said anything. There was a clock on the wall of the office that her father had inherited from his own father, and which had always kept slightly wrong time, running about 2 minutes fast. She had grown up calibrating herself against that clock. "I found something in the old files," she said. I know, her father said. She looked at him. What? I know you've been going through the loan agreements. He picked up the bourbon glass, put it down. Dale mentioned the file cabinet had been opened. He noticed the order was different. Rachel absorbed this. Why didn't you say anything? I was waiting to see what you'd do with it. She looked at him for a long moment. Were you testing me? I was watching, he said, which was a different answer. Then you know what I found. He was quiet. Daddy. She leaned forward slightly. Do you understand what those performance thresholds mean, the specific terms? I understand the land has debt against it. That's not what I asked. He looked at the glass. Franklin explained it as a security measure, something the bank needed for their own records. He said as long as the ranch performed reasonably, as long as the ranch performed above two specific benchmarks, Rachel said, which are written in terms that the bank has input in calculating. And if those benchmarks aren't met, the bank doesn't just call the notes. They have restructuring options. Franklin Voss's bank could end up with effective control of how this land is managed. Silence. The clock ticked 2 minutes fast. You didn't know that, Rachel said. Not as an accusation, as something she needed to confirm. I knew it was complicated, her father said. You said that to Mama too. He looked up. She told me, Rachel said. Not everything, just that. She paused. Daddy, I've been doing the accounts for 6 years. Why didn't you show me these agreements when you signed them? Because... He stopped. His face did something complicated. Because I handled the land decisions myself, the way my father did. Your father didn't have a Voss bank loan with performance thresholds. No. A pause. He didn't. The clock ticked. What does this mean? Her father said. For the engagement. Rachel looked at him steadily. I think you need to understand what you're actually trading before you decide whether to make the trade. He turned the letter over on the desk. Not the face-down one. He picked up a different paper, something shorter, and he slid it across to her. She looked at it. It was a letter from Franklin Voss, dated 4 days ago. It referenced the upcoming engagement party and noted, in the smooth language of a man who chose words like a banker chooses collateral, that the formalization of the family arrangement would be viewed favorably in the context of the upcoming loan review. Viewed favorably. He sent this 4 days ago, Rachel said. Yes. And you didn't show it to me. I showed it to you now. She looked at her father, at the man who had raised her on this land, who had taught her to read a cattle's weight by eye, who had once driven 40 miles at midnight because she had a fever, and the nearest doctor was in the next county, who had stood at the head of the supper table and announced her future like a line item in a ledger. He's not offering Edwin as a husband, Rachel said. He's offering Edwin as a down payment. Her father flinched. It was small, barely visible, but she saw it. And you were going to let it happen, she said. I thought it could be both, he said. I thought it was possible for it to be both a good match and a good arrangement. And now? He looked at the letter. Now I'm not sure I know what it is. Rachel stood up. I'm going to work on the numbers this week, the real ones. What the thresholds actually require, what we're actually sitting at, what the gap looks like, and whether it can be closed without the Voss arrangement. She picked up the letter and set it back in front of him. Then you and I are going to have a real conversation about what this ranch needs, not what Franklin Voss thinks it needs. Her father looked up at her. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not like a door swinging open, more like a window cracking, letting a new temperature in. All right, he said. It was a small word, but it was the first time in 31 years that her father had said all right to her and meant, I'm listening. Shit, she told Sam the next morning. Not all of it, not the letter, not the detailed terms, just the shape. She told him while they were checking the repaired fence, walking the line in the early morning before the day got hot, because walking made hard things easier to say. The engagement is tied to the bank loans, she said, more directly than I realized, more directly than my father realized. Sam walked. She walked beside him. Edwin knows, he said. His father knows. Edwin, she considered. Edwin knows enough. He's not stupid. No, Sam said. He's not. She glanced at him. What do you mean? Man like that, Sam said, Showing up to Sunday dinners, talking about the Eastern portfolio, asking about bringing in outside financial management. He's not courting you, he's conducting a site visit. It was a precise and ugly description, and it was exactly right. I know, she said. They reached the corner post. Sam checked it with one hand, a quick test of solidity. It held. What are you going to do? He said. I'm going to figure out if the ranch can survive without the Voss arrangement, she said. Financially. Actually survive, not just limp. And if it can't? She looked out across the land. The early morning light was doing something particular to the flat ground, making it look almost luminous, the way things sometimes look in the hour before the heat sets in and burns it away. She had looked at this land her whole life. She knew every rise and depression of it, every seasonal shift, every problem it presented, and every way it rewarded work. Then I need to know that, she said, and my father needs to know it clearly before anyone makes any more decisions without asking me. Sam was quiet for a moment. He ran a thumb along the top wire of the fence, not checking it, just the motion of a thinking man. You could leave, he said. She looked at him. I'm not saying you should, he said. I'm saying you could. You have skills that would get you work somewhere else, real work. You know that. This is my family's land. I know it is. My grandfather broke this ground. I know. I'm not leaving. He looked at her. Okay, he said. Then we figure out what the ranch actually needs. She noted the we. She almost said something about it. Instead, she turned and kept walking the fence line, and he fell in beside her, and she felt the solidness of having someone next to her who was not trying to manage her or redirect her or smooth anything over. You said we, she said finally. He was quiet for a beat. I did. You work here. This isn't your problem. A ranch I'm working on has a problem, he said. That's not nothing. Sam. What? She stopped walking. He stopped too. They stood on the fence line in the early morning with the land stretching out in all directions, and she looked at him directly because she needed to, and because she was tired of looking sideways at things. You know, this is more than fence repair, she said. He met her eyes. He had that quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not blankness. It was the opposite of blankness. It was a person paying very complete attention. Yes, he said. I know. And you're still here. Yes. She looked at him for another moment. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He looked down the fence line, then back at her. Because you're the most capable person on this ranch, he said. And you've been working for years in a situation that doesn't give you what that's worth. And somebody should at least stand next to that and not pretend it's fine. It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of thing that happened in stories, with music and a perfect moment of understanding. It was a man being honest in plain language in the early morning, which was, Rachel was beginning to understand, worth more than the other kind. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They walked the rest of the fence in silence, and neither of them said anything else about it, but something had been named that hadn't been named before, and the morning felt different for it. She spent 3 days on the numbers. Real numbers, not the managed version. She pulled every operational figure she had, ran the actual performance against the threshold formulas and the loan agreements, built projections for the next 18 months under 3 different market scenarios. She did it at night mostly, after everyone else was in bed, at her small table with the humming lamp, and she was not neat about it. She made mistakes and caught them. She threw out 2 full pages of projections and started them over because she had used an assumption she couldn't justify. She drank too much coffee and slept too little, and on the 3rd morning her mother found her at the kitchen table at 5:30 with papers spread in every direction and looked at her with an expression that held equal parts worry and recognition. Eat something, her mother said. In a minute. Now, Rachel. She ate something. It helped. She went back to work. What she found was this. Under 2 of the 3 market scenarios, the ranch could meet the threshold requirements without the Voss arrangement, but only barely, and only if several things changed in how the operation was managed. Not dramatically. No grand overhaul. No risk. Careful, specific changes. Reallocation of certain costs. A different approach to the cattle rotation that would improve per-head yield without adding overhead. A renegotiation of one supply contract that had been running at above market rates for 3 years because nobody had looked at it. She could document all of it. She could show the math. Under the 3rd scenario, a significant cattle market downturn, the numbers were harder. Not impossible, but harder. It would require the ranch to carry more risk than it currently was, and her father was not a man who had historically carried risk well. She sat back from the papers and thought about that. About risk and her father and the decision to sell certainty in the form of his daughter's future. She understood it. She didn't forgive it, but she understood it the way you understand a bad decision that someone made under pressure with imperfect information. Her father was not a villain. He was a man who had been afraid of losing the land and had grabbed at the thing that seemed most likely to save it and had not read the fine print. Most people's worst decisions looked like that when you got close enough. Edwin called on a Thursday evening, 4 weeks before the party. She took the call standing in the kitchen, her papers still spread on the table, her third cup of coffee going cold beside them. "I'm in town tomorrow," he said. "I thought I'd come by in the afternoon. We haven't spent much time together, just the two of us." "I'm working tomorrow afternoon," she said. "On the accounts?" "On the accounts." A brief pause. "Rachel, the engagement party is in 4 weeks. People are going to expect us to—" "I know when the party is," she said. "I've known since you moved it up without consulting me." Another pause. Longer. "I consulted your father," Edwin said. "I know you did. He was—" "Edwin." She said it quietly, and he stopped. "What do you actually want from this marriage?" Silence. Real silence, not the polished pause before a smooth answer. She had caught him without the script, or at least without the specific page he'd rehearsed for. "I want a family connection," he said finally. "I want what any man wants, stability, a partner." "And the ranch?" "The ranch is part of—" "The ranch has performance thresholds written into 3 of its loan notes that your father's bank holds," Rachel said. "And if those thresholds aren't met, your family bank has restructuring options that could leave my father with minority control of his own land." She kept her voice steady. "I read the agreements, Edwin. All of them." Silence. "That's standard lending language," he said after a moment. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, but it hadn't been replaced with anger. It had been replaced with something more careful, more evaluating. She was watching a different version of him, and she understood she was seeing the one that had been behind the Sunday dinners all along. "It's standard language that creates a very specific risk for this family," she said, "and the engagement removes that risk for your family's bank. That's a very cynical way to look at a marriage. Is it wrong?" Pause. "My father believes in the value of aligned interests," Edwin said. "I'm sure he does." She looked at her papers. "I'd like aligned interests too. I just want to make sure I understand what they are before I align anything." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want, Rachel?" It was the same question she had asked him. She recognized the deflection for what it was, but she answered it anyway because she was done calculating every word. "I want to run this ranch," she said, "with my name on something real, with the finances managed the way I've been managing them, but with the authority to make decisions, not just record them. I want the land to survive because it's run well, not because it's been pledged to a bank. That's not—" He stopped, started again. "A wife doesn't typically—" "I'm not a typical wife," she said, "and I think we both know that. The question is whether that's a problem for you or an asset." Another silence, longer than the others. "I'll come by Saturday instead," he said finally. "Give you time to finish your work tomorrow." "That's fine," she said. They hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the spread papers and the humming refrigerator, and she felt something that wasn't quite resolution and wasn't quite fear. It was more like standing on a threshold, the physical sensation of weight shifting from one foot to the other before a step. She had said true things to Edwin Voss on the phone, without apology, and he had not hung up immediately. He had come back with Saturday and a different tone. She didn't know what that meant yet. Saturday came gray and close, the kind of day that might go to rain or might just stay oppressive without committing to anything. Edwin arrived mid-afternoon in a clean car, dressed more casually than usual. No suit jacket, collar open. Rachel noticed the calculation in the casualness. I was trying something different. She met him on the porch. She did not take him inside. "Walk with me," she said. They walked. She took him out to the east pasture, past the repaired fence line, through the smell of dry grass and warm cattle, and the particular ordinary smell of a working ranch that had nothing to do with offices and bank portfolios and Sunday dinners. She let him encounter the actual place that they were talking about when they talked about aligned interests and family arrangements. He was quiet for most of the walk. He looked around himself with an expression that was harder to read than his usual ones. "My father's going to be at the party," he said, finally. "I assumed. He's planning to bring the loan review paperwork. He wants to formalize some terms at the same event." Edwin said it flat, no flourish, closer to honest than she'd heard him. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "At the engagement party," she said. "Yes." "While everyone's there." "Yes." She looked at him. The gray sky was doing something to the light that flattened everything, took out the softness. "Edwin," she said, "do you think that's right?" He looked at her. For a moment she saw something in him that was younger than the rest of him, something that hadn't yet been completely smoothed over by the family business. A flicker of something uncomfortable. "I think," he said, "it's what my father has planned. That's not what I asked." He looked away across the pasture. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked for a moment like a man trying to figure out where he actually stood in a situation he had been navigating by his father's map. "No," he said finally. "I don't think it's right." She studied him. "Have you told him that?" "Telling my father things isn't—" He stopped. A short, uncomfortable exhale. "It's complicated." She understood. She had a father with whom things were also complicated, who had also made decisions without consulting her, who had also built a version of the future that had her in it without asking if she wanted to be there. She and Edwin Voss were, in some crooked way, in the same position, being moved like pieces on someone else's board. That didn't fix anything, but she filed it. "I'm going to talk to my father this week," she said, "about the loan terms, about the thresholds, about what this ranch actually needs to survive without those kinds of strings attached." She looked at Edwin. "Whatever happens at that party, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to stand in that room and smile through a loan restructuring being called a celebration." He looked at her directly. "What will you do?" "Whatever I have to," she said. The wind came across the pasture. Somewhere behind them, the cattle moved. Edwin looked at the fence line, the repaired section, the clean, straight posts, for a long moment. Something was working behind his face. "My father didn't tell me everything either," he said. "About the threshold terms, about what the restructuring options actually entail." He said it quietly, not as a confession exactly, but as an acknowledgement, a piece of information laid on the table between them. "I found out more recently." Rachel looked at him. And I don't know what to do with it," he said. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, ran a hand over the back of his neck. "I've been doing what my father planned for long enough that I'm not sure I know how to stop." She understood that too, in its own way. "That's something you have to figure out," she said. "I can't do it for you." "No." He almost smiled. It was the most honest expression she'd seen on him. "I imagine not." They walked back. At the porch he stopped, and he looked at her for a moment with something less practiced than his usual look. "You're not going to marry me, are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She thought about the real answer, the full one. She thought about Sam at the fence line saying, "I know," in the early morning. She thought about the papers on her table and the numbers that said the ranch could survive, barely, carefully, if it was run right. "I think," she said, "that we both deserve to make better decisions than the ones our fathers made for us." Edwin was quiet. Then he nodded, one small nod, the kind that means that's a true thing even if I'm not ready to say it myself. He got in his car. He sat there for a moment before he started it. She stood on the porch and watched him go, sad. She went to find Sam. He was at the equipment shed, doing maintenance on the old water pump that had been skipping for 2 weeks. He was on his back half under the pump housing when she got there, which meant he couldn't see her face, which was maybe easier. "Edwin knows about the restructuring terms," she said. "His father didn't tell him everything either." Sam made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the pump. "He's not going to push back on his father," she said. "Not directly, but he knows the party is wrong." "Will knowing change what he does?" She leaned against the shed wall. "I don't know. Maybe not." Sam came out from under the pump. He sat up, checked his hands for grease, found some, wiped it on his work pants. "What happens at the party is going to happen in front of everyone, Checks," he said. Franklin Voss is going to use the room. I know. That's the kind of situation where people don't act like themselves. He looked up at her. They act like what everyone else expects. She looked at him. Are you worried about me? I'm thinking practically, he said. You can do both. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his wrench, put it down. Yes, he said. I'm worried about you. She hadn't expected the plain admission. She had expected him to keep it in the practical lane, to stay on the side of assessment and strategy. She had known for weeks that something more than practicality was moving between them, had known it the way you know weather before it arrives. Felt in the pressure, not yet named. Sam, she said it carefully. What happens after the party, however it goes, you should know that I'm not going to be the same person I was at that supper table when my father made the announcement. I know that. Whatever I decide about the ranch, about the engagement, about any of it, I'm deciding it myself. I know that too. She looked at him. She looked at him. I'm telling you because... She stopped, started again. Because you should know where I stand before things get complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. The shed was warm and smelled of grease and old metal, and the pump was still dripping somewhere behind him. I know where you stand, he said. I've known for a while. And? And I'm not going anywhere, he said. Unless you tell me to. She looked at him. At this man who had been in the doorway on the worst night of her recent life, and had been the only person in the room who didn't pretend everything was fine, who had checked her horse's leg without being asked, and fixed the fence her father's crew had been ignoring for seasons, and told her plainly what she was worth without making it sound like a favor. She didn't say anything for a moment. The engagement party is in 3 weeks, she said. I know. My father is going to hear the truth about the loan terms this week, from me. Whatever he does with it, I don't know. Okay. Franklin Voss is going to come to that party with paperwork and a plan, okay? And I'm going to have to stand in a room full of people who know my family and make a decision that some of them won't understand. Sam looked at her without flinching. Okay, he said. Same word, same tone, but she felt the weight of it differently this time. Not as a simple acknowledgement, but as something else. A man saying, I'll be here, whatever that means. I'll be here. She pushed off the wall. She looked at the land beyond the shed door. Her grandfather's land, her father's land, hers in the only way that mattered, even if it had never had her name on anything. She was going to keep it, not by marrying a banker's son, not by being traded across a supper table, by knowing what it was worth and what it needed and being the person capable of giving it that, which she had been all along, which Gerald Marsh had told her father, which Sam had told her to her face, which she was only now, standing in a shed that smelled like grease and old work, beginning to fully believe herself. 3 weeks. She could do a great deal in 3 weeks. She told her father on a Monday morning, after coffee, the way her mother had always advised. She laid the papers on his desk in a particular order, not the most dramatic first, but the most foundational. The original loan agreement from 8 years ago. The first refinancing, the second. The amendment that had introduced the performance threshold language, buried in page 11 of a 17-page document, worded in the way that things are worded when someone wants them to be technically present, but practically invisible. Her father read slowly. He had always been a slow reader, which she had inherited from her mother instead. She read fast and reread carefully, which was a different kind of thoroughness. She watched him move through the pages, and she did not fill the silence because the silence was doing necessary work. He got to page 11 of the amendment. She watched him read it twice. He set it down. Franklin told me this was standard, he said. Standard language can still have teeth, Rachel said. These teeth are specific. He looked at the page. The restructuring option. If either threshold falls below benchmark for 2 consecutive quarters, she said, which, under current market conditions, is not an impossibility. It's a real scenario. How real? Moderate probability under the lower market scenario. Low to moderate under the mid scenario. She had the projection pages ready, and she slid them across. I ran 3 scenarios. I marked the threshold lines. He studied the projections the way he studied land when he was trying to assess it, not looking for what he wanted to see, but for what was actually there. It was one of her father's better qualities, the willingness to look at hard ground without flinching. He had just applied it to the wrong things for too long. And if the thresholds fail, he said, Franklin's bank can restructure. Restructure in terms that would leave you with significantly reduced control of how the land is operated. Not ownership in name, but operational control. The decisions would run through the bank's approval for anything above a certain dollar threshold. He turned the paper over, turned it back. "You're telling me I've been working toward a marriage that doesn't save the ranch," he said. "It just gives it a different kind of problem." "I'm telling you that the arrangement as structured doesn't protect you from the bank," she said. "It protects the bank from you." He sat back in his chair. He didn't speak for a full minute, which was long enough to be uncomfortable, which she let be uncomfortable because he needed to sit in the accurate picture of the thing. "What do the numbers say we need?" he said finally. "Operationally?" "Yes." She pulled the third set of pages, the ones she'd worked on at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, the ones her mother had made her eat before finishing. She walked him through it. The cost reallocation, the cattle rotation adjustment, the supply contract that needed renegotiating, the projected impact of each change, the timeline, the risk. He listened. He asked questions that were better than she expected. Specific questions, the questions of a man who understood the land, even when he'd been confused about the money. When she finished, he said, "Can you actually do this?" "I've been doing the groundwork for 2 of these already," she said. "The rotation adjustment was something I flagged in the spring records. The supply contract. I know what the market rate should be, and I have documentation. The cost reallocation is the most complicated piece, but I have the math. You've been planning this." "I've been doing my job," she said, "and paying attention." Her father looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't in a long time. Not as a daughter he was making decisions for, but as a person sitting across a desk from him who knew things he didn't. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me a conversation," she said. "We're having it." He picked up the amendment page again, stared at the threshold language like he was trying to find a different meaning in it. "The engagement party is in less than 3 weeks," he said. "I know. Franklin Voss is expecting it." "I know what Franklin Voss is expecting," she said. "The question is what you're expecting, what you actually want for this ranch and this family." He set the paper down. "I want the land to be here," he said. "In 20 years, in 50. I want it to still be ours." "Then let me run it," she said. "Not alongside someone else's management structure. Not in the background while someone with a bank title makes the calls. Let me do what I've been doing, but actually do it, with the authority to make the decisions I've been making anyway." He was quiet. "I'm 31, she said. "I've been managing these accounts for 6 years without a title or a salary that reflected what I was doing. I caught an error that saved real money, and the response was to bring in an outside review. I've been working on this land since I was old enough to hold a brush, and you have never once asked me what I thought about the future of it." She kept her voice level, not cold, just honest. "I'm asking you to ask me now." The clock on the wall ticked its 2 minutes fast time. Her father picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "What do you think about the future of it?" he said. It was the first time he had asked. She told him. "What?" She was still at her father's desk an hour later, going through the supply contract line by line, when Dale knocked and came in with a look on his face that meant something had happened that he didn't want to be the one to say. "Sam Reeves in the yard," Dale said. "Robert Colton, Sr.'s out there with him." Rachel looked up. "What?" "Your grandfather's old lawyer, Morrison. He drove out this morning. He's been talking to Sam in the yard for 20 minutes. Dale shifted his weight. "I don't know what it's about, but Morrison was the one who set up the original property deed, and Sam looks like he's been told something he's not happy about." Rachel was out of the chair before Dale finished the sentence. She came around the house to the front yard. Morrison, who was 73, mostly retired, drove an old brown sedan that he refused to replace, was standing by his car with a folder of papers. Sam was a few feet away with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness he had when something was working in him that he wasn't letting show on his face. When Rachel came around the corner, Morrison looked up. Sam looked up. Something passed between the 3 of them that she didn't have words for yet. "Mr. Morrison," she said. "Miss Colton." He nodded. "I came out to speak to you, actually, but your man here was nearby and he helped me find the right gate." He paused. "Sam was just asking some questions." She looked at Sam. "What questions?" Sam looked at Morrison, then at her. "I asked him to explain why he was here." And, she said. Morrison opened the folder. Your father called me last week, before your conversation this morning, I'll add. He called me asking about the original property deed, the limitations on what can and can't be done with the land under the terms your grandfather set up. He found the page he wanted. There's a provision in the original deed that your grandfather wrote in specifically. Any restructuring of the land's operational control, any arrangement that removes decision-making from a direct Colton family member, requires a supermajority agreement of the extended family. It's not something that can be done by one person. Rachel stared at him. My father didn't know about this provision. He knew about it when the deed was established, Morrison said carefully. It was explained at the time. Whether it remained in his active memory over 40 years is a different question. Does Franklin Voss know about it? Morrison's expression said everything. That's the question I would also be asking. Sam uncrossed his arms. He didn't say anything. He was looking at the folder in Morrison's hands. The restructuring option in the loan amendment, Rachel said slowly. It may not be legally enforceable. Not without the family agreement provision being met, Morrison said, which is not a simple process. She looked at Sam. He was already looking at her. Did my father's lawyer review the loan agreements? She said, turning back to Morrison. Your father used a bank-recommended attorney for the loan closings, Morrison said. Not my office. Of course he had. Franklin Voss had recommended the attorney, probably, or someone connected to the Voss family had. A bank-recommended attorney reviewing a bank loan. She added it to the pile of things that had been structured to look like protection while functioning as the opposite. I need to make some calls, she said. I thought you might, Morrison said. He handed her the folder. The provision is on page 4. I'd suggest you also look at the case precedent I've included behind it. There's been relevant litigation in this state in the last decade that bears on the question. She took the folder. She looked at Sam. Come to the office, she said. Both of you. Sam sat in the chair across from her table, the chair where other people sat when they came to her with questions, and watched her read. Morrison had excused himself to make calls of his own, and the office was quiet except for the lamp and the distant ranch sounds and the pages turning. She read fast. She reread carefully. When she put the folder down, Sam said, Well? The provision exists, she said. Morrison's right. Any arrangement that removes operational control from a direct Colton family member requires written consent from every living adult in the extended family. Grandfather had 2 brothers. One is dead. The other is Uncle Harlan in Arizona. Does Harlan know any of this? Harlan doesn't know what year it is most of the time, she said, but his signature would still be required. Franklin Voss's loan documents don't account for that provision. No, they don't. She looked at the papers in front of her. Either because his attorney didn't find it, or because his attorney found it and didn't tell him, or because he assumed it would never matter, Sam said, because he assumed the marriage would go through and nobody would look too closely. Yes. She sat back. If the restructuring option isn't enforceable, then the leverage the bank holds is significantly weaker than Franklin Voss has been presenting it. Which means your father has more room than he thinks. Which means, she said carefully, that the entire premise of the engagement, the financial emergency that made it seem necessary, may be built on a shakier foundation than anyone realized. Sam was quiet for a moment. Franklin Voss is going to find this out eventually. He probably already has lawyers who know about it, she said, or he'll know by the end of this week when Morrison starts making calls. So what does he do when he knows you know? She thought about that. About Franklin Voss, whom she had met perhaps a dozen times over the years, always at events, always in the particular context of a man who controlled a room by appearing not to need to. A man who had built a careful architecture over 8 years, through loans and refinancings and a son's engagement, and who was now looking at a 31-year-old woman with a lamp and a ledger who had read every page. He'll accelerate, she said. The party is in under 3 weeks. If he can get the engagement formalized publicly and the loan review paperwork signed at the same event, he's established a record of cooperation that makes the supermajority provision harder to invoke later. It won't necessarily win him the legal argument, but it complicates things. He'll push your father. He'll push hard. Sam looked at the folder. What does your father do when he gets pushed? She didn't answer immediately. She thought about her father at his desk this morning, reading the amendment language twice, sitting back in his chair with the weight of it. She thought about the almost apology over the breakfast eggs. She thought about the years of Franklin explained it clearly, and it's complicated, and the supper table announcement, and the small, fragile, almost smile. I don't know, she said honestly. He's a man who has been afraid of losing this land for a long time. Fear makes people do things that aren't rational. She paused. But this morning he asked me what I thought about the future of it. That's new. Sam nodded slowly. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. My father called Morrison before our conversation this morning, she said, before I laid the papers on his desk and walked him through the numbers. He called Morrison and asked about the original deed. She let that sit for a moment. He was already looking. Sam's expression shifted. Something loosened in it. He knew something was wrong, Sam said. He knew something, she said. He wasn't sure what. He was looking in the right place without knowing exactly what he was looking for. So he's not as far behind as you thought. He's further behind than I am, she said. But he's moving. Franklin Voss called that afternoon. Rachel's mother took the call first. Franklin had called the house line, not her father's direct number, which was itself a choice. And Rachel happened to be in the kitchen when her mother came to find her with an expression that was careful and alert. Franklin Voss, her mother said. He wants to speak to your father. Your father's in the east pasture. I'll take the call, Rachel said. Her mother looked at her. Rachel. He called the house line, Rachel said. I live in this house. Her mother held her gaze for a long moment. Then she handed over the phone without another word, which was its own kind of statement. Mr. Voss, Rachel said. A brief pause on the other end, the pause of a man recalibrating. Rachel. His voice was warm in the way that experienced men's voices are warm when they're deciding how to handle something unexpected. I was hoping to speak with your father. He's in the pasture. I can have him call you back. Of course. A beat. I heard you had a meeting with old Morrison this morning. Word traveled, as Sam had said, on this ranch, on any ranch, in any county where people paid attention. Mr. Morrison came out to clarify some deed language, she said. Neutral. Accurate. Ah. His voice stayed warm, but something behind it adjusted, the way a thermostat adjusts when a window opens. I hope he wasn't stirring up confusion. Those old documents can be difficult to interpret without the full context. He was quite clear, she said. He brought case precedent. Another pause. Rachel, Franklin said, I want to say something to you, and I hope you'll hear it in the spirit it's intended. She waited. I have always had a great deal of respect for your family, he said. Your grandfather built something remarkable. Your father has maintained it under considerable pressure, and you, a small pause, artful, the kind designed to sound spontaneous. You're clearly a very capable young woman. The work you do on those accounts is evident. Thank you, she said. What I'd want you to understand, he continued, is that the arrangement between our families is meant to be a protection for the ranch. Edwin is genuinely fond of you, and the financial structure we've discussed is meant to provide stability, not to, whatever concerns you may have encountered in those older documents, not to compromise your family's position. She listened to the whole thing. She let him finish. Mr. Voss, she said, the restructuring option in the Third Amendment to the Second Refinancing Agreement allows your bank to assume operational control of this property under conditions that are within your bank's ability to influence. The original deed contains a supermajority provision that makes that restructuring option legally questionable without family consent. If your attorneys reviewed the deed thoroughly before those loan closings, they found that provision. If they didn't, that's a significant oversight. She said it without heat, without drama, in the tone she used when she was reading numbers back to her father. I'd appreciate you sharing that with your own counsel before the party. Silence. Not the polished kind. The actual kind where a person is genuinely recalculating. I'll look into that, Franklin said. His voice was still level, but the warmth was gone now, just the level. I think that would be wise, she said. I'll let my father know you called. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and her heart beating hard enough that she could feel it in her ears, which nobody looking at her would have known because her face hadn't moved. Her mother was in the doorway. Well, her mother said. He'll call his lawyers today, Rachel said. He already knows about the provision. I'd bet on it. What happens next? Rachel set the phone down. He either pushes harder at the party to establish a public record, or he comes to the table with a different offer. She thought about it. Or he does both, because that's what a man like that does. Her mother was quiet for a moment. What about Edwin? Rachel thought about Edwin on the porch, looking at the fence line. My father didn't tell me everything either, the flicker of something younger than the rest of him. Edwin is a separate question, she said. Why? She didn't see Sam until evening. He had spent the afternoon on the water system. The pump that had been skipping had finally given them a full diagnosis after a week of intermittent complaints, and the repair needed parts he'd sourced from the supply depot, which he'd driven to himself without being asked. He was cleaning up at the equipment shed when she found him. Franklin Voss called, she said. He looked up from what he was doing. I took the call. He stopped what he was doing. I told him about the deed provision, she said, that Morrison brought case precedent. Sam looked at her for a long moment. How'd he take it? Like a man who already knew and was now calculating what the other person knowing meant for his timeline. Sam picked up the rag again, finished cleaning his hands. He'll come at your father. Yes. Before the party. Probably this week. He set the rag down. What does your father need from you right now? It was the right question. Not what do you do next or what's the plan. What does your father need? Because the thing in motion now wasn't just about legal provisions and loan documents. It was about a man who had been afraid for a long time and was about to be squeezed by someone who knew how to use that fear. He needs to feel like he has options, she said, real ones. Not just the engagement or financial collapse. He needs to see the third path clearly enough to walk it. The numbers you showed him this morning. The numbers are part of it, but numbers aren't what moves my father. She thought about him at the desk, reading slow, setting the amendment page down. What moves him is the land. He needs to understand that the third path keeps the land. You've already shown him that. I showed him the math, she said. I need to show him something he can see and touch and stand on. Sam looked at her. Something moved in his face that she was learning to read. Not the obvious things, not the big expressions, but the small adjustments. The particular quality of his attention sharpening. The cattle rotation adjustment, he said. Yes. I can have the numbers to you by tomorrow morning, he said. Practical numbers, not just projections. What it would actually look like on the ground, how much it shifts the per-head yield, what the labor adjustment means in real terms. You know the rotation well enough for that? I've been watching it since I got here, he said. I have thoughts. She looked at him. 3 months ago, she had not known his name. She had seen him in a doorway and registered the fact that he wasn't celebrating. Now she was standing in the equipment shed at dusk with the last light coming orange through the door, and he was offering to put his practical knowledge of her family's land into numbers she could use to save it. She didn't have clean words for what that was. Thank you, she said. I'll have them by 7, he said. She nodded. She started toward the door. Rachel? She turned. He was looking at her steadily, the way he always did. No decoration on it, just direct. Your father is going to get a call from Franklin Voss before the week is out, he said. Probably with some version of a better offer. Something that looks like compromise but is still designed to move in one direction. I know. When that happens, don't be the one who talks to your father first, he said. Let him sit with it. Let him come to you. She studied him. Why? Because if you're there when the offer comes in, it looks like you're against the deal, he said. But if he sits with it alone and then comes to you, he's already starting to question it himself. You're not the opposition. You're the person he comes to when he needs to think clearly. She stared at him. She stopped. It's just watching how people work, he said. It's not complicated. It was actually quite complicated. It required understanding her father's psychology, the particular architecture of how he made decisions, the way his pride could become a barrier if he felt cornered. Sam had been on this ranch for 3 months, and he had read her father more accurately than she had in 31 years of being his daughter. When did you figure that out? She said. Figure what out? How he works. Sam considered. Week 2, he said. Maybe week 3. He picked up the rag again, began folding it in the methodical way he folded things. He watches you when you're not looking. She went still. Not in a complicated way, Sam said. He watches you work. He watched you correct the supply order in the yard 2 months ago you probably didn't notice. He watched you move the cattle before the storm. He watched you walk Dale through the fence assessment. He set the folded rag on the shelf. He knows what you're worth. He's just been 20 years slow in doing anything about it. She didn't speak for a moment. You're saying he's going to get there on his own. I'm saying he's already getting there, Sam said. This morning was evidence of that. Don't get in the way of it by making it feel like a battle he has to win. She thought about that. About the morning conversation, the careful way. Her father had asked, "What do you think about the future of it?" About how she had, maybe for the first time, answered honestly instead of managerially. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went back to the house. She did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because some things, she was learning, were worth leaving alone in the moment. Franklin Voss called her father on Wednesday. Rachel was in the supply room when it happened, doing inventory that she'd been deferring for 2 weeks. She heard her father's voice in the office, on the other side of the wall. Not the words, just the cadence, the particular rhythm of a man listening to something difficult. She stayed where she was. She counted sacks of mineral supplement. She logged the tally in the notebook she used for inventory. She found a discrepancy of 8 units between the delivery invoice and the physical count, and she wrote it down and thought about what it meant that she had known, without being told, the exact moment to not go through that door. Sam had been right. She stayed in the supply room for 40 minutes. When she came out, her father was standing in the hallway with the look of a man who had just set down something very heavy and wasn't sure yet whether to pick it back up. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Franklin called," he said. "I know." She kept her voice neutral. "I was in the supply room." He nodded. He moved toward the kitchen and she followed because you follow a man who needs to move while he thinks. He poured coffee. He poured one for her without asking, which meant he wanted her to stay. He sat down. She sat across from him. He offered new terms, her father said. She waited. He said there had been an oversight in the legal review of the original deed, her father said. He said his attorneys identified it, and they want to revise the restructuring language in the amendment to align with the deed provision. He looked at his coffee. He framed it as correcting an error on their part. He framed it as a concession, Rachel said. Yes. While removing the piece that couldn't be enforced anyway. Yes. Her father looked up. He's still expecting the engagement to proceed. He said the loan review would be favorable regardless, those were his words, but that formalizing the family relationship remained the preferred outcome. She was careful with what she said next. What did you tell him? I told him I'd discuss it with my family. He said it in a way that was different from the way he usually said things like that. He said family and looked at her, specifically. And now you're discussing it, she said. Yes. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He was quiet for a moment and she let him be. Rachel, if the restructuring option is unenforceable, what is the bank's actual leverage? The notes themselves, she said. If the ranch can't service the debt, they can call the notes. That's standard and real and doesn't depend on the deed provision. Can we service the debt? Under the changes I outlined, yes. Marginally, in the first year. More comfortably in year 2 and 3 if the cattle market holds mid-range. And if it doesn't hold, then it's harder. But the same would have been true with the Voss engagement because Edwin's family money doesn't pay ranch debt directly. It would have provided operational backing, which we can source other ways if we need to. Her father looked at the table. He was doing the slow reading again, but in his head this time, going through the document of everything he'd built and everything he'd risked. I made bad decisions, he said. You made decisions under pressure with incomplete information, she said, and some of them were bad. That's not the same thing. He looked up. Something in his face that she hadn't seen in years, or maybe had never seen quite like this, uncertain, and choosing to be honest about the uncertainty rather than covering it. The engagement, he said. Edwin. You need to call it off, she said, quietly, directly. Not because I'm asking you to, because it was built on a financial premise that doesn't hold the way Franklin presented it. Edwin is not a bad person, but the arrangement was never what it was sold as. Her father was quiet for a long time. What does Edwin know? He said. More than he was told, she said, less than he needed to make his own clean decision. Her father nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee and drank from it and set it back down. I'm going to call Morrison, he said. Get a proper legal reading of where we stand before that party. That's the right call. And I'm going to talk to Edwin's father again, with clearer information than I had the first time. Also right. He looked at her. You're not going to say I should have done this 6 months ago. Would it help if I did? No? Then I won't. He almost smiled. The same fragile almost smile as before, but this time it felt more solid. The financial changes you outlined, he said. The rotation, the supply contract. Yes. Start on them, he said. Don't wait for the party. Don't wait for the engagement to be formally addressed. Start the work. She looked at him. You mean that? I mean it. He held her gaze. You know what this ranch needs better than I do right now. That's not easy to say. He picked up his coffee again. But it's true. She sat with that for a moment. The lamp hummed. The clock on the wall somewhere in the house ticked 2 minutes fast. Sam Reeve has practical numbers on the rotation adjustment, she said. I was going to go over them tonight. Her father raised an eyebrow. Reeve's been working on that? On his own time, she said, because he read the maintenance log and understood the problem. Her father was quiet for a moment. The fence held, he said. The fence held, she confirmed. He nodded slowly. Have him walk me through it. When he's got it ready. She looked at her father, at the man who had raised her on this land and taught her to love it, and then, for a long time, forgotten to ask what she thought about it. And she felt something complicated and not entirely clean, the way feelings are when they're real. Not forgiveness exactly, not the sudden restoration of something that had been damaged, more like the beginning of a recalibration, the first page of a different set of books. I'll tell him, she said. She got up. She took her coffee with her and she walked out of the kitchen and through the back door into the evening air, which was cooler than it had been all week, carrying the particular smell of the land after heat, and she stood on the step for a moment before she went to find Sam. Above her, the first stars were coming out over the flatland, and somewhere in the south pasture, cattle were moving in the dusk, their shapes dark against the pale ground, and the ranch made its evening sounds around her, the creek running low to the east, the windmill turning in the light air from the south, the particular settling of an old structure that was, maybe for the first time in a long time, on ground that was a little less shifting than it had been the day before. 3 weeks until the party. Things could happen fast in 3 weeks, and things could happen slowly, and what mattered was knowing the difference. She went to find Sam. Sam had the numbers ready at 6:50 in the morning, which was 10 minutes earlier than he'd promised, which was the kind of thing Rachel had come to expect from him without quite being able to explain to anyone else why it mattered. They were at her table, her lamp, the small office off the kitchen that smelled like old paper and coffee, and the particular accumulated weight of 6 years of careful work. He had written everything by hand, which she hadn't expected. Not because it was wrong, but because most people didn't bother anymore. The handwriting was plain and direct, no flourishes, numbers laid in clean columns with clear labels. She could have read it in the dark. The rotation adjustment, she said, going through it. 3 phases, he said. First phase moves the younger stock to the north section 6 weeks earlier in the season than current practice. The ground up there recovers better and the per-head condition improves about 8% by the time they come back to market weight. I've seen this on 2 other operations. It works. What's the risk in the first season? Labor adjustment in week 3, he said. You need 2 extra hands for the northern move because the terrain is different and the animals don't know it yet. After the first season they do, so the cost is front-loaded. She made a note. Second phase. Timing the south pasture rest cycle. Right now it's being grazed 2 weeks longer than it should be in late summer. The grass is getting short enough that you're losing feed efficiency and the recovery time before winter is too compressed. Pull them out 2 weeks earlier, the pasture comes back stronger. You need less supplemental feed the following spring. That's a short-term cost for a medium-term gain. Yes, but the math works out clearly by month 14. He reached across and pointed to a line in the 3rd column. Here. She looked at the line. He was right. The math worked out clearly. 3rd phase, she said. The supply contract, he said. That one's not mine to work out. That's you and whoever you call. But I've flagged the 3 items where I know the market rate from other operations I've worked. All 3 are running above what you should be paying. She looked at the flagged items. Feed supplement, fencing material, and veterinary supply. He had listed what she was paying and what he believed the market rate to be, with a note on each saying confirm before negotiating, not presenting his numbers as gospel, presenting them as starting points for someone who knew how to use them. She sat back in her chair and looked at the pages. If all three phases work, she said, and the supply contract is renegotiated to market rate, we land above the performance threshold even in the lower market scenario. By a narrow margin, he said, in year one. Narrow is enough. Narrow is enough if nothing else goes wrong, he said, and something always goes wrong. She looked at him. You're not trying to talk me out of it. No, I'm telling you what narrow means. You're the one who decides if it's enough. She looked at the pages again. The numbers were real. They were careful and specific, and they had been arrived at by a man who read maintenance logs and checked fence posts for plumb level and drove to the supply depot on his own time and wrote things out by hand because he was precise about what he put on paper. She thought about Gerald Marsh saying these are good books and you should have a title. She thought about Morrison and the deed provision and Franklin Voss recalibrating on the other end of a phone line. She thought about her father in the kitchen with both hands around his coffee mug saying, start the work. She thought about the supper table 4 months ago, the fork in her hand, the glass she hadn't raised. I'm going to show my father these today, she said. Good. He wants to talk to you about the rotation specifically. He said to have you walk him through it. Sam was quiet for a moment. When? This afternoon, if you're free. He looked at her with an expression that was close to dry. I work here. I know you work here. I'm asking if you're free this afternoon to sit down with my father. Yes, he said. I'm free this afternoon. She nodded. She started to gather the pages. Rachel, he said. She looked up. The party's in 11 days, he said. I know. Whatever happens between now and then, your father talking to Franklin, Morrison's legal assessment, Edwin. He paused. I want you to know that none of it changes what I said in the equipment shed. I meant that without conditions. She looked at him across the small table with the humming lamp between them, in the early morning quiet of the office where she had spent 6 years doing careful work that nobody had properly named. I know you did, she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and stood up, and went to start his day. She sat alone with the papers and the lamp, and a feeling that was too large and too quiet to be called by any simple word. Her father met with Morrison on Thursday. Rachel drove him in, which was new. Her father had always driven himself everywhere, but he'd said the morning of, without preamble, that he could use company on the road, and she understood that what he meant was that he needed to think out loud, and that she was now the person he did that with. They talked for the 40-minute drive, not about the meeting specifically, about the land, about what the rotation adjustment would mean for the north section, about a memory her father had of her grandfather doing something similar in a drought year that nobody else remembered because it wasn't written down anywhere and he'd been the only one paying attention. He never wrote anything down, her father said. Grandfather. He kept everything in his head. That's why you almost lost the deed provision, Rachel said, not unkindly. Her father made a sound that was halfway between acknowledging it and resisting it. He trusted people to know things they should know, he said. He trusted too much, she said. There's a difference between trust and assumption. Her father looked out the window at the flat land going past. When did you get so hard-edged? I'm not hard-edged, she said. I'm accurate. There's a difference there, too. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother says that, too, he said. About the difference between things. Mama's the smartest person in that house and has been for 40 years. Her father turned from the window and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the road. Yes, he said simply. She has. Morrison's office was in a building that had been on the same corner of town since before Rachel was born, with the kind of interior that accumulates slowly over decades. The same furniture, the same carpet edge worn down by the same path of foot traffic, the same certificates on the wall in frames that had darkened slightly with age. Morrison himself looked exactly the same as he always had, which was the particular quality of very old men who had decided at some point to simply be themselves and stop changing. He walked them through the deed provision clearly, with the case precedent he'd gathered. The language was specific, and the legal history was, as far as Morrison could establish, in the Colton family's favor. Any restructuring of operational control without the supermajority family consent was legally challengeable. He was careful to say challengeable rather than nullified because Morrison was the kind of man who did not overstate things, which was exactly why her grandfather had used him. So the bank's restructuring option, her father said, is contestable, Morrison said. I would not say it is definitively void without litigation, but Franklin Voss's legal team, if they're competent, knows this. The revision he offered to Rachel was an attempt to quietly resolve a problem he'd rather not litigate. He doesn't want it tested in court, Rachel said. I would estimate not, Morrison said. It would raise questions about the original loan closing process that would be uncomfortable for the bank. Her father absorbed that. He sat in the client chair with his hands on his knees, and he looked like what he was, a man who had built something over 40 years and had come very close to losing control of it without understanding how. What do I actually owe them? He said, setting aside the options and the thresholds, the real debt. Morrison had those numbers ready. He laid them out. They were significant, but they were not unmanageable, particularly if the operational improvements Rachel had outlined were put in place. The real picture, stripped of the restructuring language and the social pressure and the 8 years of a banker's careful framing, was harder and cleaner and more survivable than the version Franklin Voss had been presenting. You're not in as much trouble as he led you to believe, Rachel said. Her father looked at her. He made it sound like the engagement was the only... The engagement made the notes more secure for his bank, she said. That's what it was for. Her father was quiet. Morrison folded his hands on the desk. Robert, he said, in the way of a man who had known someone long enough to use their first name with full weight behind it, your daughter has a clear picture of this situation. I would follow her lead. Her father looked at his hands. He looked at Rachel. He looked at Morrison's certificate on the wall, the one from 1987, as if it might say something useful. All right, he said. It was the same word as before, but fuller now. More resolved. The word of a man who had stopped looking for the exit he'd been expecting and had turned to face the actual room. He called Franklin Voss that evening. Rachel was not in the room. She was in the kitchen, and she could hear her father's voice through the wall. The cadence of it this time was different from the Wednesday call. Steady, not raised, not heated, but with a firmness in the floor of it that she hadn't heard from him in years. The call lasted 14 minutes. She counted. When he came into the kitchen, his face was tired but clear in the way faces get when a thing that's been suspended finally lands. I told him the engagement was off, her father said. Rachel set down the pen she'd been holding. I told him I'd be honoring the loan notes as structured per the original terms, he said, and that any further discussion of the amendment language would go through Morrison. How did he take it? Badly, her father said, but quietly. He's a man who keeps his anger for when it's useful. He sat down at the kitchen table. He asked about Edwin. What did you say? I said Edwin was a grown man who could make his own decisions. He paused. Which is also something I should have applied to you considerably earlier. She looked at him. I know, he said. I know, Rachel. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was warm and the evening was coming in through the window and somewhere outside the windmill was turning in the light air. The party, she said. I'll call Margaret Voss tomorrow and explain that the engagement is no longer proceeding, he said. The guest invitations can be converted to a ranch gathering. We have them every summer anyway. People will talk. People talk about everything in this county, he said. They'll talk more if we let it drag out. She studied him. You're sure? I've been sure since Monday morning, he said. I was just... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, which was the gesture he made when he was being honest at cost to himself. I was waiting to be sure I was sure, if that makes any sense. It makes sense. I'm an old man who made the same mistake twice, he said. Once with the loans, and once with you. Both times I trusted someone else's reading of a situation I should have read myself. She thought about what Sam had said, that her father had been watching her for years, that he knew what she was worth, but had been 20 years slow about it. She thought about watching someone from a distance and knowing something, and still not doing anything about it, because the distance was comfortable, because the doing something required admitting the watching had meant something. She understood that too, in her own way. The rotation adjustment starts next week, she said. Sam has the plan ready. He's going to walk you through it this afternoon, or tomorrow, if today's too much. Today, her father said. I'd rather move. She nodded. He looked at her across the kitchen table, at his daughter who had managed his books for 6 years and saved his land from a trap he'd walked into with his eyes partly open, who had stood in a room full of people at a supper table with a fork in her hand and hadn't raised her glass, who had been right about nearly everything and had been quiet about being right in a way that had cost her something real. I'm going to add your name to the operational management deed, he said. Morrison will draw it up. Your title will be Operations and Finance Manager. It's real and it's formal, and it should have happened years ago. She went still. She had wanted this for a long time. She had known she deserved it for almost as long. But there was something about the actual moment of it, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening with the windmill turning outside. That was nothing like she'd imagined. It was smaller and more ordinary, and somehow that made it more real, not less. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I'm late. You're here, she said. That's what counts. The party happened anyway. Not as an engagement party. That word was quietly dropped from every conversation by the morning after her father's call to Franklin. But as the summer gathering the Colton Ranch had hosted every year for as long as Rachel could remember, with the yard strung with lights and the tables set out and enough food that nobody went home hungry. Margaret Voss did not come. That was expected. Franklin Voss did not call back after the Thursday conversation, which was also expected. The silence from that direction was the silence of a man reassessing his position, not conceding it, but there was nothing more to reassess right now because the thing he'd been building toward had been dismantled cleanly and legally and in full daylight. Edwin came. That was not expected. He arrived an hour into the gathering, without his father, in clothes that were still too clean for a ranch party, but less aggressively so than usual. He found Rachel near the fence at the far edge of the yard, where she'd gone to take a breath away from the noise. I heard from my father, he said. I assumed you would. He's not happy. I know. Edwin stood beside her and looked out at the yard, at the people gathered, at the lights, at the ordinary life of a working ranch in summer. She had the sense he was looking at it like something he was calculating the value of, but there was also something else in it, something closer to honest curiosity, the kind that didn't have an agenda. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. The afternoon you walked me through the east pasture, he said, and you said we both deserved better decisions than the ones our fathers made for us. Paused. I've been thinking about that. And I think you were right. He said it without the smooth professional finish she was used to from him, just plain. I've spent my whole career executing my father's plans. Good plans, mostly. Plans that benefited a lot of people, some of them. He looked at his hands. But I have never once made a decision for a reason that was only mine. She looked at him. At this man she had been assigned to marry, and who had, in his own way, also been assigned to her. Who was not bad, not cruel, not the villain of the piece, just a man who had learned to operate inside his father's architecture and had never yet tried to find out what he might build himself. What will you do? She said. I don't know yet, he said. The most honest thing he'd ever said to her. That's a new feeling. She almost smiled. It gets easier. Does it? No, she said. But you get better at it. He nodded. He looked out at the yard again, and after a moment he said, The ranch is going to be fine, isn't it? It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. It is. Good. He said it like he meant it, which she believed. He was not a man without feeling. He was just a man who had kept his feelings organized in the wrong drawers for too long. I hope things go well for you, Rachel. I hope the same for you, she said. And she meant it. He left not long after. She watched his car go down the drive and felt nothing dramatic. Not relief, not triumph, not the particular lightness of an escape. Just the quiet settling of a thing that had been in the wrong place finally being set down correctly. She turned back to the yard. Sam was at the far end of the tables, talking to Cody and two of the other hands, holding a cup of something and listening more than talking, which was his natural mode in a crowd. I was wearing a clean shirt, which on him looked like a significant occasion. He felt her look and found it, the way he always did, and across the yard in the summer light and the noise of the gathering he simply nodded at her. She nodded back. Her father found her later in the evening when the party had settled into its comfortable late phase. The people who were staying, the people who needed to get home had gone, and the yard had taken on the particular warmth of a summer night that has been well used. He stood beside her and they looked at the land together, the way they used to when she was small, and he would take her out before bed to look at the stars over the flat ground and tell her the names of things. Gerald Marsh is going to consult on the supply contract renegotiation, her father said. I called him this week. Good choice. He asked about you. She looked at him. What? He said, and I'm quoting here, how is that young woman with the lamp and the ledger doing? Her father almost smiled. I told him she was running the ranch. I'm not running it yet. You're running the part that matters most right now, he said. The rest will follow. She looked out at the land. The lights from the yard threw shadows long and soft across the ground, and past the lights the land went dark and wide in the way it always did, the way it had her whole life, familiar as her own breathing. Sam's going to stay on, her father said. She kept her expression neutral. Good, he's the best hand you've had in years. He's more than a hand, her father said. I think you know that. She was quiet. I'm not announcing anything at supper tables, her father said, and his voice had a dry quality that was close to humor, close to apology, close to acknowledgement of what those two things had cost the last time. I'm just saying that a man who reads the maintenance log and fixes the fence and works the rotation plan on his own time and cares whether he's being honest about things. He stopped. That's a man worth knowing better. She looked at her father. You talked to him. This afternoon, he said. We talked about the rotation and some other things. What other things? Things a father and a man have to sort out, he said simply. It was fine. She thought about what that conversation might have looked like. Her father, who expressed himself in slow and oblique ways, and Sam, who expressed himself in plain ones. She thought they had probably understood each other better than either would have expected. He's a good man, Daddy, she said. I know he is, her father said. That's why I asked him to stay. They stood together in the evening for a while, not filling the silence with anything, which was its own kind of progress. The supply contract renegotiation took 3 weeks and saved the ranch 14% on annual costs, which was not dramatic but was real. Gerald Marsh, who was meticulous and enjoyed the work in the way that certain people enjoy any task that rewards precision, found 2 additional overcharges that Rachel hadn't flagged, which she took as useful information about the limits of doing everything yourself. The rotation adjustment went into its first phase at the end of summer. It was not perfect. The north section was harder on the animals in week 2 than Sam had projected, and they lost 2 weeks of expected condition improvement dealing with a parasite issue that nobody could have predicted, which was one of the things Sam had meant when he said something always goes wrong. They adjusted. By week 6, the per-head condition numbers were moving in the right direction. Her father watched all of it. He came out to the north section 3 times in the first month, which was more than he'd come out to check anything in years. He asked questions and mostly listened to the answers. He did not, even once, override a decision that Rachel had made. He came close, twice, when the cattle market dipped, and his instinct was to cut the first phase short and move everything back to the original schedule. Both times Rachel showed him why that would cost more in the long run. Both times he said, all right, and let it stand. The third time he started to say something about the timing and then stopped himself and said, never mind, you have the number. She felt something shift permanently in the way they occupied the same space, not into something easy, into something true. Morrison completed the operational deed amendment in October. It was a Thursday. Rachel thought later that significant things in her life seemed to happen on Thursdays, which was probably just coincidence and the way the mind finds patterns. And he drove out to the ranch to have the paperwork signed in person rather than mailing it, which she suspected he had done partly for the ceremony of it. They signed at the kitchen table. Her mother made coffee. Her father signed first, and then Rachel, and Morrison notarized it with the particular practiced motion of a man who had notarized a great many things over 50 years of practice. When it was done, Morrison gathered the papers and said, "Your grandfather would have done this 20 years ago, Robert, but he'd have been glad to see it done." Her father said, "So would I, 20 years ago." Morrison drove back to town. Rachel's mother washed the coffee cups. Her father went out to the south pasture because there was work to do, and there was always work to do. Rachel sat at the kitchen table for a while with the copy of the document in front of her. Operations and Finance Manager, Colton Ranch, established by deed amendment. It was paper and ink, and it was also 31 years of work, and it was also 6 years of a lamp humming and ledgers that nobody adequately recognized, and a mistake caught in 45 minutes that 4 months of everyone else had missed. It was small and permanent and entirely real. She folded the document and put it in the folder she used for important things and got up and went back to work. The first heavy frost came in November, which was earlier than usual and harder, and it tested the South Pasture recovery timeline in a way that the original projections hadn't fully accounted for. 3 days of temperatures that didn't get above freezing, and the ground was solid in places that needed to be flexible. And there was a 48-hour period where the water line to the north section did something complicated that required Sam and 2 other hands working in the dark with frozen fingers and equipment that was not designed for those conditions. Rachel was out there with them, not because she was needed for the mechanical work. Sam knew the water system better than she did, and he'd have solved it without her. She was out there because it was her ranch and her land and her responsibility, and because standing inside while other people worked a crisis had never been something she was able to do with any comfort. At 2 in the morning, with the water line finally cooperating and the worst of it behind them, she was standing near the truck with a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and Sam was a few feet away doing the last check on the repaired connection. "It'll hold," he said. "You sure?" "Reasonably." He stood up. His hands were red from the cold. She handed him the thermos without asking, and he drank from it and handed it back. "I miscalculated the frost timing in the projection," she said, "by about 3 weeks. I'll correct it for next year." "The South Pasture recovery was still ahead of the original schedule," he said. "The frost set it back, but it didn't erase the gain." She looked at the dark land around them. The frost had laid a thin silver coat over everything, and in the truck's headlights it looked almost luminous. The same quality she'd noticed in early morning light months ago when things were just beginning to change shape. "Sam," she said. He looked at her. "When you came to this ranch," she said, "when you walked through the kitchen door at that supper, were you looking for something?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the thermos, and he looked at it like it might contain the right answer. "I was looking for a place where the work mattered," he said, "and the people doing it were honest about what it was. Did you find it?" He looked at her. In the cold dark, with the frost on the ground and the water line repaired and the cattle settled and the thermos of lukewarm coffee between them, he looked at her the way he had in the doorway at the supper, directly, without any decoration on it, paying complete attention. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. The cold was doing something to her face that probably excused whatever was on it. She was tired and her hands were cold, and she had been running on 4 hours of sleep for 3 days, and this was absolutely not the circumstance anyone would choose for the moment. She'd been quietly waiting for without admitting she was waiting for it. But it was the circumstance they had, and she had spent enough of her life waiting for better conditions before doing the necessary thing. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You'd have to tell me to." "I'm not going to tell you to." He held her gaze. The particular stillness of him that she had been learning to read for months, not absence, not blankness, the opposite of those things, was very present. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a dramatic moment with the right light and the right words. It was 2 people who had been honest with each other for months, standing in a frozen field at 2 in the morning, saying the true thing with the shortest words available, which was, Rachel had come to understand exactly how Sam Reeves said the most important things. They married the following summer beneath the cottonwood trees at the east edge of the yard, which had been her grandmother's favorite spot, and which in July threw the kind of shade that feels like a gift. It was not a large wedding. Her parents, Morrison and his wife, Cody, who was now full-time crew and who cleaned up remarkably well for the occasion, Harlan from Arizona, who flew in and cried at everything, a handful of neighbors who had known the Colton ranch through all its seasons. Her mother cried. Her father did not, but he put his hand on Sam's arm when Sam came to stand beside Rachel and said something quiet that she didn't hear, and that Sam nodded at once, the way he nodded when something landed true and square. She wore her grandmother's ring, which her mother had kept in a box for 40 years waiting for the right occasion. She had not known her mother had it. When her mother brought it out the morning of the wedding, Rachel had sat down on the bed and looked at it for a long time. She would have liked him, her mother said. She would have liked that I chose him, Rachel said. Her mother looked at her. Yes, she said, that too. The ceremony was short because neither of them saw the point in length for its own sake. The officiant was a woman named Clara, who had been doing ceremonies in the county for 30 years, and who understood that some people wanted elaborate and some people wanted true, and that the best ones were the same ceremony regardless. When it was done, Rachel's father shook Sam's hand and then, unexpectedly, he pulled him into a brief, stiff embrace of the kind that men who are not accustomed to embracing manage, slightly awkward, clearly meant. Sam bore it with the straightforward dignity he brought to most things. The party afterward ran long and easy into the evening, and Rachel ate more than she'd planned and laughed at things she hadn't expected to be funny. And at one point, she and Sam stood at the edge of the yard, looking at the land the way she and her father had stood at the party the summer before, and the parallel of it was not lost on her. "Different standing here now," she said. "Some things are," he said. She leaned into his shoulder, which was warm and solid and smelled like the good soap he used on occasions, and like the ranch underneath it, which was always there. "The north section is looking strong," he said. "Sam." "What?" "We just got married." "I know," he said. "The north section is still looking strong." She laughed, not politely, not the managed laugh she used in rooms where she was calculating what to show. The actual laugh, the one that came from somewhere below calculation. "Yes," she said. "It is." The ranch did not become something grand in the years that followed. It did not get famous or triple in size, or produce the kind of story that gets written up as an example of something. It was a working ranch that worked better than it had, managed by people who understood it, carrying debt that was being repaid steadily according to a plan that had been built on honest numbers. The performance thresholds in the Voss Bank's notes were met in year 2 and exceeded in year 3. The bank, under new regional management by that point, Franklin Voss had retired, which Rachel neither celebrated nor mourned, renegotiated the loan to more standard terms without the amendment language. Morrison oversaw the process. It took 6 weeks and cost less than the original attorneys had billed for the loans that had caused all the trouble. Edwin Voss, she heard through county conversation, had left his father's bank the following spring and taken a position with a development company in another state. She heard he was doing well. She believed it. He had been a man looking for room to make his own decisions, and he had, eventually, found some. She wished him nothing complicated. Her father aged in the way that men who have found their footing age, not easily, not without complaint, the joints giving trouble by year 3, and his patience for cold weather shortening considerably, but with the particular settled quality of someone who had stopped fighting the wrong battles and had found better ones. He came out to the north section with Sam 2 or 3 mornings a week when the weather was good. She knew because she could see them from the office window, moving through the land together with the unhurried pace of men who had more to talk about than there was time for. She didn't know what they talked about exactly. She had stopped needing to know. Her mother took up the supply contract correspondence in year 2, which nobody had suggested and which turned out to be a natural fit. She had a memory for numbers that Rachel had always known about, and a firmness in negotiation that she had kept mostly hidden for 40 years. And the supply vendors, who had been overcharging the Colton Ranch for years, on the quiet assumption that nobody was paying attention, found very quickly that someone was now paying attention with considerable focus. "Mama," Rachel said, the first time she saw her mother's renegotiation notes. "Don't mama me," her mother said. "I've known these prices were wrong since 2019. Nobody asked me. I'm asking you now." "I know," her mother said. "That's why I'm doing it." Rachel thought about what it meant that there were 2 of them now. 2 women in the same family who had been underestimated by the same systems for overlapping decades, and who had, at different points, been handed the room to stop being underestimated. She thought about the chain of it, about what her mother might have done if someone had asked her 40 years earlier, about what the Colton Ranch might have looked like with 2 generations of that particular kind of attention applied to it from the beginning. She couldn't go back and fix that. Nobody could. But she could make sure the next generation didn't need to wait. There is a specific thing you understand when you've spent years doing work that doesn't have your name on it, and then you see your name on something real. It is not primarily the name that matters. You already knew what you were doing, and the knowledge of your own worth does not depend on anyone else ratifying it. What matters is the acknowledgement, the formal admission by the world around you that what you saw about yourself was accurate. Rachel had known her own worth since she was 23, sitting at a table at midnight fixing someone else's errors in a ledger that nobody was going to thank her for. She had not needed Edwin Voss's engagement to prove anything about her value. She had not needed Sam's admiration to confirm she was capable. She had not needed her father's deed amendment to make the work real. But the deed amendment was real. And it mattered. Not because she had needed it to know who she was, but because the people around her had finally built something that matched the truth she had already known. And that is a different thing from validation. That is the world correcting itself into accurate alignment with what was already true, and the relief of it, small, private, arrived at 6 years late, was its own particular form of something she never had a word for. She sat at her table one evening in the second fall, Sam out in the yard talking with her father about something involving the winter feed schedule, her mother somewhere in the house with her contract correspondence, the lamp humming as it always had. And she looked at the operations and finance manager deed copy in its folder, and she thought about the girl who had set down a fork at a supper table and decided, without knowing exactly how yet, that her life was not going to be announced to her. She had not been entirely right about everything. She had made miscalculations. The frost timing, a projection in the third quarter of year one that she'd had to revise twice, a conversation with her father that she'd started too soon and had to come back to, a conversation with Sam that she'd started too late and that he'd waited on with the patient steadiness that was simply his nature. She had not done it perfectly. She had done it honestly, and with the full weight of what she actually knew, which turned out to be considerable. Outside, Sam laughed at something her father said. She could hear it through the window. Not the words, just the sound of it, easy and real in the evening air. She picked up her pen. The fourth quarter numbers needed reconciling. The North Section rotation was moving into its second cycle, and there were decisions to make about the spring calendar, and the supply contract had a renewal coming in 60 days that she was already preparing for. There was work to do. There was always work